When time moves forward but you don't. There's a moment you don't notice until long after it's passed. It's the moment when life, your life, stops moving forward, but everything around you keeps going. At first, it's subtle. Your friends start new jobs, fall in love, travel to new cities. They speak of things that haven't happened to you. And in the beginning, you smile. You cheer them on. You clap when they succeed. You say, "I'm so happy for you," like it's a reflex. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter part of you starts whispering, "Why not me?" You tell yourself to be patient, that your time will come, that you're on a different path. You repeat these affirmations not because you believe them, but because silence feels too heavy. And slowly, almost invisibly, you begin to fall out of rhythm with the world. Their timelines become faster. Their days fill up. And you start to notice how empty your calendar looks by comparison. This is not envy. This is not bitterness. This is something else. Something softer. Sadder. It's the grief of feeling forgotten by time itself. The psychology of being left behind doesn't always stem from people. Sometimes, it's the calendar that betrays you. The seasons change, and you're still in the same apartment. Still scrolling past opportunities that you're too afraid to chase. Everyone seems to be writing new chapters. And you're still stuck rereading the same paragraph. You try to catch up. You sign up for things. You force yourself to go out. You post a picture that feels a little too curated just to remind the world, and maybe yourself, that you still exist. But it doesn't stick. Because the truth is, you're not really present in the moment. You're trying to keep up appearances while your soul lingers somewhere in the past, where life felt simpler, slower, maybe even kinder. This sense of being left behind by time hits hardest during transitions. Weddings, graduations, moving days, birthdays, moments where everyone gathers to celebrate progress. You show up, you smile, you give the gift, but something aches inside because the milestone you're witnessing isn't yours. And deep down, you're not sure it ever will be. Psychologically, this triggers a form of temporal dissonance. Your internal timeline is no longer aligned with your external world. It creates a rift between your identity and your context. You begin to question your value in the ecosystem of your social circles. You feel obsolete, outdated, like a phone that can't run the latest apps. This disconnect seeps into your self-worth. You start interpreting other people's progress as evidence of your failure. You may not say it aloud, but the thought repeats in your mind like a loop. If they're moving forward and I'm not, then something must be wrong with me. This is how the mind turns stillness into shame. You begin comparing timelines, hers, his, theirs and yours. And what used to be admiration curdles into quiet self-loathing. You don't wish for their failure, but you do wish your life would catch up. And when it doesn't, your brain starts looking for explanations. You blame your upbringing, your mental health, your circumstances, yourself. The narrative you construct becomes less about reality and more about preserving some sense of control, even if that control comes at the cost of compassion for yourself. Being left behind by time also manifests physically. Your body begins to carry the tension of stagnation. You wake up tired, not because you didn't sleep, but because you didn't dream. You eat for comfort, not nourishment. Your steps become slower, not because you're lazy, but because moving without direction feels pointless. There's an invisible weight pressing down on you, not heavy enough to collapse you, but just enough to keep you grounded in place. People might say, "You'll get there." But where is there? And why does it feel like everyone else got a map you never received? The most painful part isn't being stuck. It's watching the world spin without you. The laughter that doesn't pause to see if you're okay. The invitations that stop coming. The milestones you once celebrated with others. Now scrolling past you like scenes from a life you no longer recognize. And yet, there's a strange resilience in this experience. Because when time forgets you, you start to remember yourself. When you stop chasing the world's clock, you begin to hear your own. It ticks more slowly. It moves less predictably, but it is yours. And maybe, just maybe, that's not a punishment. Maybe it's permission. Permission to grow quietly, to heal without witnesses, to evolve outside of performance. While the world applauds speed, you're learning the beauty of stillness. While others collect achievements, you're learning the art of staying, of enduring, of not rushing your own unfolding. And slowly, the shame begins to soften. You start to notice the small victories. Getting out of bed on a hard day, sending that one email, saying no when you wanted to please. These moments don't get celebrated, but they matter. They are not signs of failure. They are proof that you are still here, still trying, still moving, even if the world doesn't notice. Eventually, you may realize that time didn't leave you behind. It just gave you space. Space to redefine what matters, to unlearn the belief that progress must be loud, public, and Instagrammable, to understand that not every chapter needs applause. Some chapters just need peace. So tonight, as you lie down, let go of the need to catch up. You are not a race. You are a rhythm, and your rhythm is not broken. It's just quieter than most. Sleep well, quiet soul. Time is not your enemy. It's just waiting for you to feel safe enough to move again. When you begin to question if your absence would even matter, there's a quiet moment, usually not loud or dramatic, when a thought enters the back of your mind. If I stopped showing up, would anyone even notice? It doesn't come from anger or attention-seeking. It arrives slowly, like a tired whisper at the end of a long line of emotional disappointments. It's not about wanting to be the center of attention. It's about wanting to matter, to someone, to anyone, in a way that feels real and reflected. You start noticing how easy it is for people to overlook your presence, how rarely you get asked how you're actually doing. You realize that if you don't text first, the thread of conversation simply ends. If you don't show up, no one asks where you went. Your name fades from plans, from calendars, from memories. And that's when it begins, the internal questioning of your own significance in the lives of people you once felt connected to. This is not depression in its most obvious form. It's not hopelessness that stops you from functioning. It's something far more subtle and harder to explain, emotional invisibility. You're not unwell. You're just increasingly unsure whether your presence genuinely registers in the lives of others, whether your contributions, your energy, your attention, whether any of it actually leaves an imprint. Psychologically, this experience ties into a phenomenon known as interpersonal neglect, not just being actively excluded or mistreated, but passively forgotten. You're not pushed away. You're simply not pulled closer. You're not disliked. You're just not considered. You exist in a liminal space in people's minds, tolerated, maybe appreciated in theory, but not truly felt when you're missing. This passive disconnection is one of the hardest emotional landscapes to live in, because there's no obvious betrayal to process, no incident to point to, just a quiet and consistent lack of recognition. You start to wonder if you're imagining things, if you're just being sensitive, if maybe you're expecting too much. But as the days go on, that feeling doesn't fade, it deepens. Not because you're becoming less stable, but because your instincts are slowly collecting evidence. They didn't check in. They didn't notice. They didn't ask. The next stage is internal adjustment. You begin adapting to being unnoticed. You stop expecting messages. You scroll past group updates and teach yourself not to feel left out. You start speaking less, volunteering less, asking less of people, not because you've grown detached, but because you're shielding yourself from the pain of being reminded how optional you've become. And once that pattern sets in, a dangerous loop begins. The less you show up, the less people think of you. The less they think of you, the less they reach out. The less they reach out, the more confirmed your absence feels, as if it truly wouldn't matter. You become a ghost in your own life, showing up for obligations, but emotionally dissociating from connection. What makes this experience so devastating is that it begins to erode something fundamental, your relational self-worth. You begin to believe that your place in other people's lives is fragile, temporary, easily replaceable. That maybe your personality just doesn't stick. That maybe you're forgettable. That if you were more exciting, louder, more dramatic, more something, people might notice when you're gone. And that belief doesn't just stay in your personal life. It spills into your sense of identity. You second-guess your value in workspaces, in creative spaces, in partnerships. You wonder whether anything you do really makes a lasting impression, whether your departure would cause more than a minor disruption, or even that. Over time, this creates an internal withdrawal. You stop volunteering your ideas. You stop opening up to new people. You stop believing in reciprocity. You still function, but connection becomes transactional, conditional. You start to assume that people will only notice you if you're performing something, being entertaining, being useful, being endlessly supportive. You become a presence defined by output, not being. Emotionally, this can lead to a profound form of detachment. You might smile and respond politely. You might make eye contact and engage in conversations, but you're not really there. Your inner world becomes a private echo chamber, constantly asking, what would change if I wasn't here? This isn't suicidal ideation. It's not a desire to disappear entirely. It's the weariness of emotional non-existence. It's the pain of realizing that, while people might like you, they don't need you. That while they enjoy your company, they don't miss it when it's gone. And that realization can either break you or awaken something else. Because sometimes, underneath the sadness, there's a different kind of question waiting to emerge. One that doesn't ask, would they notice if I was gone? But instead asks, why have I tied my worth to being noticed at all? What if the problem isn't that you're invisible, but that you've been measuring your existence through the lens of people who never truly knew how to see you? What if your value isn't meant to be proven through external validation, but reclaimed through self-recognition? That shift doesn't happen overnight. It begins in the smallest acts of defiance. You write something, even if no one reads it. You dress in a way that pleases you, even if no one compliments you. You speak a truth, even if it's met with silence. You stop waiting for people to invite you into relevance, and instead, you begin living as though your existence is already meaningful, regardless of whether others acknowledge it. Because the hardest truth is also the most liberating. You may never be deeply noticed by everyone you hoped would see you. Some people will never recognize your presence. Some people will continue walking forward without ever glancing back. But that doesn't mean your life is empty. It doesn't mean your impact is small. It means their lens is limited. And the beauty of self-awareness is that it offers a new kind of presence, one rooted in internal confirmation, not external permission. You become your own witness. You begin noticing yourself, the way you comfort others, the way you show up, even when exhausted, the way your thoughts deepen with solitude, the way your laughter sounds when it's unfiltered. You begin remembering that you are real, whether others confirm it or not. Over time, this self-recognition becomes your anchor. And slowly, the question shifts again, from would they notice I'm gone, to what do I want to be present for? And that question brings you back to life. Because being left behind is painful, yes, but forgetting to see yourself, that's the true abandonment. And now, you're remembering. When you start pulling away before anyone can leave you again, there's a behavior that people often mistake for independence, for being emotionally strong, for not needing anyone. But beneath it, something else is quietly unfolding, a habit formed from too many disappointments. You stop reaching out. You stop sharing too much. You stop showing people the parts of you that are still raw, still needing. And slowly, without ever deciding it out loud, you begin to leave people before they have the chance to leave you. On the surface, this looks like self-sufficiency. You're the friend who says, I'm good, even when you're not. You keep your circles small. You're always listening, rarely speaking. You convince yourself you're better off not needing anyone. But internally, something more defensive is at play, a preemptive withdrawal. Not because you dislike people, but because you've learned how painful it is to be fully present for someone only to realize they won't do the same for you. So you begin creating distance before closeness can turn into loss. You become polite instead of vulnerable, supportive, but not revealing. You manage the conversation. You notice what others need, but you withhold your own internal world like it's something that has to be earned with extraordinary care, and few ever get that far. Psychologically, this is a form of anticipatory detachment. It develops when the nervous system has been repeatedly exposed to emotional abandonments, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, and begins to interpret closeness as a risk, not a reward. You've been here before. You felt someone slowly fade, and you remember what it did to you. So now, you stay half present, half prepared to exit at any moment. You're friendly but guarded, helpful but unavailable. And most people don't notice, because you're still around. You still smile. You still laugh. You still engage. But the intimacy stops just before the edge. And when someone asks why, if they ever do, you might say you're just busy. You're focused on yourself. You don't like drama. You don't trust easily. And all of that might be partially true. But what's really happening is that you're bracing for disappointment before it arrives. You're managing your expectations down to zero so that you don't have to feel the sharp drop of being let down again. Over time, this self-protection starts to feel like identity. You begin believing you're just not the type to need people, that you're better off alone, that it's too much effort to maintain connection. But what you're really doing is keeping yourself in a state of emotional preemption, always a few steps away from closeness, always a few decisions ahead of vulnerability, always pulling away just enough to feel safe. This pattern often doesn't look like fear, it looks like competence. You take care of yourself. You don't depend on others. You manage your stress. But underneath that, there's often a profound sadness, one that's harder to name because it's buried under self-sufficiency. It's the sadness of not being fully known, of not being fully met, of walking through life without ever handing someone the full weight of your truth because you've decided, maybe long ago, that no one can carry it. And the difficult part is, this belief can become self-fulfilling. When you keep people at arm's length, when you hide the parts of you that are struggling, when you don't let others see the ache, they assume you're fine. They stop checking in. They don't dig deeper. They think you don't need them. And that confirms what you feared all along. They wouldn't have stayed anyway. But the truth is more complex. People can't stay if they were never let in. And sometimes, it's not that they wouldn't have held you. It's that you never gave them anything to hold. This isn't blame. This is trauma. This is conditioning. This is the logical result of trying to survive in a world where your presence was once too optional for comfort, where people showed love inconsistently, where the ones you counted on most sometimes disappeared, not always physically, but emotionally, gradually, without warning. So now, you leave first, not with your feet, but with your walls. You answer in shorter texts. You share less detail. You wait to be asked instead of volunteering. You practice conversations in your head, but rarely speak them aloud. You create the illusion of closeness while quietly ensuring there's no risk of being seen too clearly. And this keeps you safe, but it also keeps you alone, because the part of you that longs for real connection is still there. It's just buried. It watches from beneath the surface, hoping someone will see through the defenses, hoping someone will notice the careful silence, hoping someone will say, "You don't have to protect yourself with me." But that's the catch. You don't want to hope too loudly, because if that hope gets ignored, the pain will be sharper than ever. So you live in between, too distant to be hurt, too present to be at peace. And over time, this quiet pushing away becomes chronic. People don't ghost you. They just stop trying. And you take that as confirmation of your decision to never fully trust. Another reason to pull back. Another reason to believe you were always meant to walk alone. But what if the answer isn't to abandon connection entirely? What if it's to redefine it? What if you didn't have to choose between full vulnerability or full avoidance? What if it's okay to say, I'm scared of being left behind, so I tend to leave first, even when I don't want to? That admission, even just to yourself, can begin the process of reconnection, because underneath the self-protection, there is still a need, not a weakness, a human need to be known, to be held, to not carry everything alone. And denying that need doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it harder to meet. Eventually, you may find someone who doesn't get tired of gently knocking on your emotional door. Someone who doesn't interpret your distance as rejection. Someone who knows what it's like to flinch at closeness, but still chooses to stay. But they can't find you if you've already emotionally disappeared. And even if they never come, you still deserve your own presence. You deserve to stop abandoning yourself just to avoid the risk of others doing it first. You deserve to stay. When you start shrinking yourself to avoid being left again, there's a survival response that doesn't often get recognized for what it is, a quiet shrinking. Not physically, of course, but emotionally. You begin softening your edges, diluting your opinions, rounding out your intensity. You adjust your volume, your excitement, your needs. And you do all of this not because it feels right, but because something inside you has started associating your full self with loss. You've begun to believe that the more visible you are, the more likely people will walk away. So you become smaller, more agreeable, less demanding, easier to digest. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to become too much. You rehearse conversations before you speak. You hesitate before asking for help. You tell yourself that your silence is maturity, that your flexibility is strength. But somewhere in that equation, you begin to disappear. This isn't a dramatic vanishing. It's a gradual one. You stop sharing when something excites you. You hold back when something bothers you. You second-guess if your emotional reactions are appropriate. And over time, the people around you stop seeing your complexity, not because they're ignoring it, but because you're no longer offering it. You've trained yourself to edit your own humanity in order to remain acceptable. Psychologically, this is a direct result of rejection trauma. It's the mental pattern that forms when past experiences have taught you that your full self is a liability. Maybe you were too honest with someone and they withdrew. Maybe you opened up about your anxiety and they stopped reaching out. Maybe your enthusiasm was labeled clingy, or your needs were described as draining. Over time, you stop trusting that authenticity is safe. So you filter, you mask, you overmanage your identity. And what's terrifying about this isn't just the internal censorship. It's the way this pattern rewards itself. The smaller you become, the more people seem to like you, or at least tolerate you. You're less confrontational, less intense, more pleasant, more convenient. You begin getting approval for the very version of yourself that you had to cut down to be accepted. But deep down, something starts to erode. Because while you may be liked, you're not actually seen. You're not being valued for who you are, only for the version of yourself that never asks for too much. And eventually, this turns into quiet resentment. You smile while others speak over you. You nod even when you're uncomfortable. You go along with decisions that don't reflect your needs. And the whole time, there's a muted ache in your chest, a feeling of being present in a room but not fully there, a feeling of emotional vacancy. The most painful part is realizing that the people around you think everything's fine, because you've hidden it so well. They don't see the trade-off you've made. They don't know that you've given up pieces of yourself just to maintain closeness. They see your calm and call it composure. They see your silence and call it strength. But inside, you're shrinking. With every "it's okay," that wasn't okay. With every "no worries," when you were hurting. With every "I understand," when what you really wanted was to be understood. And then one day, they leave anyway. Despite all the ways you tried to be easy to love, they still walk away. And that's when the illusion cracks. That's when the heartbreak hits deeper. Not just because they left, but because you tried so hard not to give them a reason to. You watered yourself down until you were nearly invisible. You minimized your presence, your needs, your feelings, all in the name of safety. But in doing so, you abandoned the very thing that makes you lovable in the first place, your fullness. And now you're left with not just their absence, but the realization that even shrinking yourself couldn't keep them, that you made yourself small, and they still didn't stay. And that pain, it's not just sadness. It's a fracture of trust, not just in them, but in the whole strategy you built around survival. Because shrinking doesn't prevent abandonment. It just ensures that if it happens, you won't even feel like yourself when it does. So what do you do with that truth? You begin by grieving the versions of yourself you erased to keep people close. You mourn the enthusiasm you muted, the needs you denied, the vulnerability you buried. You acknowledge that those sacrifices weren't evidence of weakness. They were acts of fear, acts of protection. And now, you give yourself permission to reclaim what you lost. You begin showing up in small, brave ways. You say what you actually feel, even if your voice shakes. You state preferences, even if they make things complicated. You allow yourself to be visibly disappointed, excited, overwhelmed, whatever's real. You begin unshrinking. And yes, some people will pull away. Some may feel discomfort when you start showing your full range. But that's not proof that you're wrong to be whole. It's proof that you were only ever safe when you were incomplete. And that's not the kind of safety worth sustaining. Because the right people, the ones who see your bigness and stay, they won't just tolerate your truth. They'll invite it. They'll thank you for showing up with your rough edges, your strong feelings, your full capacity for depth. They won't require you to shrink in order to remain. But even before they arrive, even if they never do, you still owe it to yourself to take up space. To stop treating your emotions like they're too loud. To stop seeing your needs as burdens. To stop making yourself small in rooms where you already feel invisible. Because shrinking doesn't protect you. It just makes the loneliness harder to explain. And you deserve more than quiet sadness in the name of fitting in. You deserve to be seen, not just accepted, but understood. When you stop sharing your wins because no one seems to celebrate them anymore. There's a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being rejected, ignored, or misunderstood, but from being unacknowledged at your highest moments. It starts subtly. You do something meaningful, something you're proud of. You finish a long project. You get a promotion. You take a risk and it works out. You grow. You change. You rise in ways that took real effort. But when you try to share it, the reaction doesn't match the weight of what it meant to you. A quick nice, a distracted congrats, or worse, silence. So you brush it off. You tell yourself not to make a big deal. You don't want to seem like you're fishing for compliments. You don't want to be the person who needs applause to feel okay. But still something doesn't sit right. You feel the absence of recognition in your body. That moment that should have felt full now feels flat. And without realizing it, you start pulling back. The next time something good happens, you pause. You hesitate. You wonder if it's even worth mentioning. You remember how last time felt, not bad. Exactly. But empty. And so, you tell yourself to keep it to yourself. You internalize a quiet belief. My joy isn't something people value. My growth doesn't move anyone. My accomplishments don't resonate. This doesn't come from ego. It comes from a deeply human need, the need to be witnessed. Not just when you're in pain, but when you're evolving. When you're finally feeling proud of yourself after months or years of work. When something clicks, and you want to say, look at this. I did it. Not for approval, but for connection. Psychologically, this experience falls under a lesser discussed concept, emotional invalidation through absence. We talk often about being criticized or judged, but less about what happens when our successes are met with indifference. Over time, emotional invalidation doesn't just discourage expression. It changes how we relate to joy itself. We start believing that joy is private, that it's safer to keep good news quiet. That excitement is better processed alone. This slowly reshapes how we show up in relationships. We become quieter. not just about our wins, but about our progress. We stop mentioning when things get better. We stay silent about healing, about little victories, about breakthroughs. And in doing so, we start reinforcing the belief that celebration is not meant for us, or at least, not meant to be shared. And the silence becomes a loop. The less we share, the less people engage. The less they engage, the more we assume it's not worth sharing. Eventually, we begin to feel emotionally alone, even in communities, even among friends, even in long-standing relationships. Because it's not about who's around us. It's about who sees us when we come alive. And often, those closest to us don't even realize what's happening. They may not intend to be dismissive, but they miss the subtext. They don't see how much effort it took to reach this point. They don't realize that when we share good news, we're not bragging, we're reaching out. We're saying, "This matters to me. Will you hold it with me for just a moment?" But when that reach is met with flat energy, with distracted replies, or with nothing at all, we start carrying our happiness like a secret. It becomes a solitary event. And over time, we may even lose the impulse to celebrate altogether. Because what is celebration if it echoes back at you with nothing in return? This doesn't just affect how we share our achievements. It starts to affect our identity. We begin to question whether our milestones are real if no one reflects them back. We wonder if we're overreacting, overvaluing ourselves, being too much, and slowly, we start diminishing our own light, not because it stopped burning, but because no one ever looked at it long enough to say, "That's beautiful." And yet, we continue to show up for others. We clap when they win. We send long messages when they get promoted, when they finish school, when they launch something new. We listen to them practice their speeches, plan their parties, post their highlights. We give them the very thing we've stopped expecting for ourselves, emotional celebration. And that contrast only makes the silence around our own moments feel heavier. But at some point, the pattern begins to wear us down. We find ourselves muting our enthusiasm before anyone else has the chance to. We stop expecting anyone to say, "I'm proud of you." And that's when a subtle grief sets in, not just for the moments we shared and felt unseen, but for all the ones we stopped sharing entirely. So what's the deeper cost of this kind of being left behind? It's not abandonment in the traditional sense. It's the kind that happens inside connection. It's the feeling of emotional solitude while technically being surrounded. It's knowing that the people in your life like you, care about you, but don't quite notice when you're becoming someone better. And that's what stings. Not that they've left, but that they never arrived where you now are. Healing from this doesn't mean demanding applause. It means acknowledging your desire to be witnessed and validating that desire yourself first. It means letting go of the idea that celebration must always be communal, while still seeking the right people who know how to hold your joy with reverence. It may mean cultivating new relationships, ones that don't just show up for the storm, but stay to admire the rebuild. It may mean reevaluating who in your circle reflects back your growth. And it may mean having real conversations about emotional visibility, saying things like, "When I share something I'm proud of, I really hope it matters to you too." It will take effort, vulnerability, disappointment, at times, but it will also give you back something you've been robbed of, the right to feel expansive in your own story. You don't have to shrink your joy to fit someone else's inattentiveness. You don't have to dull your light just because no one's clapping yet. You can be proud without permission. You can let yourself feel fully, even in the absence of external validation. And over time, if you keep honoring your own victories, no matter how small, no matter how quiet, you'll begin to attract people who feel them too, who don't just say, "That's great," but say, "I know how hard you worked for that," who mirror back your effort with warmth, with energy, with depth, and most importantly, you'll stop waiting for celebration to come from outside, because it will already be growing inside you, in the way you pause to acknowledge your own milestones, in the way you speak kindly to yourself after a risk, in the way you hold your own shoulders and say, "We did it," even if no one else sees. I do, when you're always there for others, but no one knows what you're going through. There comes a point when being emotionally available for everyone else becomes a form of isolation. You become the one people call when something goes wrong. You're the person they rely on when they feel lost, confused, overwhelmed. You give thoughtful advice. You check in on birthdays, after breakups, during job interviews. You know how to say the right thing at the right time. People often tell you how much they appreciate you. But underneath all the gratitude and familiarity, a question begins to echo. Do any of them really know me? It's a quiet question, not loud or desperate, but it grows over time, especially during the moments when you're going through something yourself, something painful, something heavy. And as you try to hold it all together, you realize there's no one you naturally turn to, not because they wouldn't listen, but because you don't believe they would understand. Or worse, because you're afraid of being seen in a moment of need when you've built a reputation on being the strong one. This kind of emotional loneliness is incredibly subtle. You may appear well-adjusted, grounded, even content. You're not distant. You're not antisocial. You show up. You contribute. But your emotional world remains mostly internal, like a closed journal no one's ever asked to read. People assume you're okay because you make them feel okay. They assume you're balanced because you're always helping others balance. They don't ask what you need because, honestly, they've never had to. Psychologically, this dynamic often emerges from role conditioning, especially among people who were cast early on in the caretaker role. Maybe you were the sibling who kept things calm during family tension, or the student who didn't want to cause trouble, or the friend who everyone leaned on but rarely checked in with. Over time, you began equating your worth with your emotional availability. You learned how to soothe, how to listen, how to disappear so that others could feel safe. And now, as an adult, you've become the go-to person, the one who always has capacity, even when you're silently struggling. What makes this experience harder is that no one sees it as a problem. In fact, they often praise you for it. They call you wise, grounded, selfless. And it's true, your emotional intelligence likely is high. Your compassion probably runs deep. But what they don't see is the cost, the internal exhaustion, the emotional backlog, the quiet resentment that forms when you realize people are comfortable opening up to you, but rarely ask. And what about you? How are you really doing? Eventually, this gap between what you give and what you receive starts to change how you see yourself. You begin to wonder if your struggles are even valid. You might downplay your pain, telling yourself things like, other people have it worse, or it's not that big of a deal. You compare your problems to those you've helped others through and convince yourself that yours don't count, that your job is to hold space, not to need it. But emotional strength isn't the absence of need. It's the ability to feel deeply and remain present. And you, for all your stability, are still human, still vulnerable, still deserving of care. The problem is, by the time you realize how isolated you've become, the habits are already cemented. You're used to being the listener, not the speaker, the supporter, not the one who leans. You may even feel uncomfortable opening up, not because you don't want to, but because you no longer know how. You've spent so long focusing outward that turning inward, and then expressing that inwardness, feels unnatural, even risky. And so you wait. You wait for someone to notice the change in your tone. You wait for someone to ask the right question. You drop subtle hints in conversation, hoping someone picks up on them. But most of the time, they don't. Not because they don't care, but because you've trained them not to look for signs. You've conditioned them to believe you don't need that kind of attention. And so they believe you, which only deepens the ache. And that ache slowly evolves into something else, a protective distance. You start to emotionally withdraw, not dramatically, not with walls, but with slight hesitation. You speak less during check-ins. You stop offering information. You keep things surface level. You begin existing around people, rather than with them. And yet, you still show up when they need you, because that's who you are. But over time, this dynamic becomes unsustainable. You begin feeling burnout, not from work or tasks, but from the weight of being emotionally present for people who don't understand the depth of what you're holding yourself. You might find yourself daydreaming about disappearing for a while, just going off-grid, just long enough to see who notices, who reaches out, who says, "Where have you been?" But more than that, you find yourself wanting, maybe for the first time in a long time, to be known, not just liked, not just needed, but understood. You want someone to ask about the heaviness you've been carrying, to notice the difference in your energy, to say, without prompting, "You're always there for everyone else. Are you okay?" And if that never comes, it doesn't mean you're unworthy of it. It means your patterns were built in places where you learned to protect others more than yourself. But it's never too late to shift. The shift doesn't have to be loud. You don't need to make an announcement. You don't need to stop being who you are. You just need to start including yourself in the emotional ecosystem you've always managed for others. You begin small, by naming your own needs, by checking in with yourself, by letting someone know, "Actually, I've been going through something too." Not in a dramatic or forced way, but in an honest one. And slowly, you create space for reciprocity. You stop answering immediately. You allow pauses. You practice being heard. You allow yourself to be supported, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Because you don't have to earn your worth through emotional labor. You don't have to be the strongest one in every room. You are not valuable because you're always okay. You are valuable even when you're not. When you realize they moved on without ever looking back. There's a moment, sometimes weeks, sometimes months after someone leaves your life, when a different kind of pain sets in. Not the initial heartbreak, not the confusion, but something colder, more final. It's when you realize they didn't just leave. They moved on, fully, quietly, without slowing down, without second thoughts, without a single glance over their shoulder. It's not that you expected them to be stuck like you were. You knew they might continue living, laughing, starting new chapters. But there's still a quiet expectation that when something meant that much, both people would carry some lingering weight. That maybe they'd scroll through old photos once in a while. That maybe they'd remember you when a certain song played. That perhaps, once in a while, they'd wonder how you were doing, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. But none of that comes. Instead, you watch, from a digital distance or emotional memory, as they rebuild, as they post new moments with new people, as they speak with ease, smile with no trace of hesitation, as if the chapter with you was nothing more than a detour. You realize they are not paused. They are not looking back. And that knowledge stings in a way that is hard to articulate, because you are still there, holding the pieces, still wondering what went wrong, still thinking about conversations you wish had ended differently, still waking up from dreams where their name echoes in your subconscious. And while you carry them in fragments, they seem to have erased your name entirely from the script of their life. This is what abandonment can feel like when it's emotional rather than logistical. It's not just about someone physically exiting your life. It's about watching them thrive in a version of the world where you're not even a footnote. It's the quiet realization that you've been completely left behind, not only in geography, but in thought, in relevance, in emotional presence. Psychologically, this kind of experience can trigger something known as relational invalidation. It happens when the weight you placed on a connection is not mirrored by the other person's behavior after it's ended. When someone you felt deeply bonded to carries no visible sign of the impact. It doesn't just feel like loss. It feels like you misread the entire relationship. You start questioning your own perception. Were we really that close? Did I imagine the intimacy? Was I more invested than they ever were? This cognitive dissonance can be brutal. Because not only are you grieving someone's absence, you're grieving the version of the story you told yourself about what the relationship meant. You start replaying memories with a different filter. You begin scanning for clues, for signs that maybe they were already disengaging long before you noticed, for red flags you ignored, for emotional silences you mistook as comfort. And worst of all, you start blaming yourself. You ask questions like, did I push too hard? Was I boring? Was I needy? Was I just a temporary stop while they figured out what they really wanted? This spiral isn't rooted in truth. It's rooted in the gap between your presence in their life and your apparent absence from their memory. Over time, this gap begins to reshape how you think about future relationships. You start guarding your heart more, not dramatically, but methodically. You reveal less. You invest slower. You assume people will eventually leave, and worse, that they'll forget you once they do. So you hold back, not because you're incapable of connection, but because you're terrified of being invisible in someone else's aftermath again. This kind of wound doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention, but it settles deep. It hides in the spaces between messages that never come, in the birthdays missed, in the realization that you were once part of someone's daily life. And now, you're not even a passing thought. It hides in the untagged photos, the unfollowed accounts, the empty inbox, and it whispers the cruel question you don't want to hear. Did I ever matter at all? But here's what needs to be said. Their silence is not the full story. Their moving on is not a verdict on your value. Some people compartmentalize pain by pretending it didn't exist. Some rewrite history to cope. Some genuinely don't know how to hold the emotional weight of what they left behind, so they simply don't try. And while that may look like strength or coldness, often it's a kind of avoidance that helps them keep going. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it about them, not about you. The depth with which you felt something is not invalidated just because they appear untouched. You lived it. You were present. You gave something real. That's what matters. Your presence was not wasted, even if it wasn't remembered in the way you hoped. And eventually, not quickly, not easily, but inevitably, you begin to understand something more powerful than their absence. You are still capable of feeling, still capable of remembering without collapsing, still capable of loving deeply, even in a world that sometimes forgets to love back with the same intensity. That's not weakness. That's capacity. And perhaps one day, someone will meet you in that same capacity. Someone who doesn't leave without a trace. Someone who doesn't pretend they never knew you. Someone who looks back, not to stay, but to acknowledge where they came from. Until then, you owe yourself the acknowledgement, because you are not erased. You are not disposable. You are not an accidental character in someone else's highlight reel. You were there. You mattered. And whether or not they look back, you remember. And that means something. When you become afraid to let new people in because of the ones who left without warning, there's a point in some people's lives where the fear of abandonment stops being just a fear. It becomes a framework, a lens through which every new interaction is filtered. You might not even realize it at first. You meet someone new. They seem genuine. They reach out. They're kind. They ask the right questions. And for a brief moment, you let yourself hope. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe this person won't leave. But as soon as things begin to feel warm, familiar, or close, a part of you starts preparing for the exit. Not because you want to, but because experience has conditioned you to do so. You've known the kind of closeness that ends without warning. The kind where everything seems fine until it isn't. Where the texts stop for no reason. Where the tone changes overnight. Where a person once fully present simply fades into the background, slowly. Then suddenly. And so now, when someone starts getting close, you hesitate. Not because you don't like them. Not because you don't want connection. But because the cost of losing them after letting them in feels too high. You've been here before. You've trusted people who turned out to be temporary. You've opened your heart only to be met with absence. And that experience stays with you, even if you don't talk about it. It lives in your nervous system, in your caution, in your timing. This kind of fear often doesn't look like fear. It presents itself as control. You space out your replies. You act like you don't mind unpredictability. You pretend you're fine with distance. But inside, you're watching closely for signs that they're slipping. You keep track of tone changes, response times, emotional inconsistencies. You want to trust them. But part of you is already planning how you'll recover when they eventually pull away. Psychologically, this is tied to attachment-related hypervigilance. It's the result of repeated disruptions in connection, often unexplained, often unresolved, that train the brain to treat relationships as unstable environments. Your mind learns that closeness is followed by withdrawal. That vulnerability is answered with silence. That love is never a guarantee, only a loan. So instead of feeling safe in someone's presence, you remain partially guarded, constantly scanning for cues that history might repeat itself. And the irony is, the very behaviors meant to protect you can also sabotage connection. You come across as distant, inconsistent, emotionally cautious, not because you're playing games, but because you're afraid of giving too much of yourself to someone who hasn't proven they'll stay. And yet, most people don't know how to interpret that. They see your reserve as indifference, your hesitation as disinterest. They don't see the history behind it, the nights you spent trying to figure out why someone disappeared, the conversations you never got closure from, the trust you rebuilt brick by brick, only to watch it crumble again. And that's the hardest part, feeling misunderstood for your caution, when it was pain that taught you to be careful. Eventually, if this pattern goes unaddressed, you start avoiding closeness altogether. You convince yourself you don't need deep relationships, that you're better off keeping people at a distance. You might even pride yourself on being independent, and in many ways, you are. You've learned to meet your own needs, to comfort yourself, to survive your own abandonment. But deep down, there's still a craving for connection. It's just buried beneath layers of protective silence. Because what no one tells you about being left behind is that it doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewrites the rules of how you relate to others moving forward. It teaches you that people are unpredictable. That words mean less than consistency. That someone's warmth today doesn't guarantee their presence tomorrow. And this belief, while understandable, can quietly rob you of new experiences, of healthy closeness, of people who do mean what they say. But when your body associates closeness with pain, it doesn't matter how kind or safe the new person is. Your instinct is still to shield. That's what makes healing so difficult. You're not just working against logic. You're working against muscle memory, against the imprint of loss, against the feeling that, no matter how good things are, the ground could still fall out from underneath you. So what's the way forward? It starts with recognition, with acknowledging that your hesitance isn't irrational. It's earned. It's the result of real experiences that shaped the way you approach connection. You're not broken for being cautious. You're not dramatic for having boundaries. But you are responsible for making sure those boundaries don't become emotional walls you hide behind for the rest of your life. You begin by slowly testing safety. You open up in small ways. You pay attention not just to how people respond when you're helpful, but how they react when you're honest, when you're vulnerable, when you're not performing emotional labor, but simply asking to be seen. You notice whether they disappear at the first sign of depth or whether they stay. Listen, reflect. You also start telling the truth, not just to others, but to yourself. You stop pretending you don't care. You stop minimizing your desire for closeness. You stop acting like your past didn't affect you. You begin saying things like, "I'm not quick to open up because I've been hurt before," or "I move slowly in new connections because I've experienced sudden endings." Not as excuses, but as context, as honesty, as a signal to yourself that you're no longer hiding from your history. And slowly, when the right people come, the ones who don't get scared by your caution, who don't require constant cheerfulness, who don't punish your depth, you allow yourself to stay just a little longer. You practice showing up without the escape plan. You give them a chance to prove they're not the ones who left you before they even had the chance to show otherwise. Because you deserve to know what connection feels like when it isn't built on fear. You deserve to know what it feels like to be close without being abandoned. You deserve to stop bracing for exits and start trusting your own right to remain. When you start comparing your healing timeline to theirs and feel like you're failing, there's a particular kind of pressure that sets in after someone leaves your life. A pressure that doesn't come from them directly, but from the invisible clock that starts ticking in your mind. You begin to measure time not in days or weeks, but in milestones. How long it's been since they left. How much better you should be feeling by now. And more painfully, how quickly they seem to be moving on compared to you. You don't want to look, but sometimes you do. You scroll through their social media or hear something about them from a mutual friend. They're going out, traveling, laughing in pictures, posting motivational quotes, starting new chapters. Their life seems unpaused, forward-moving, full of momentum. Meanwhile, you're still stuck somewhere between the loss and the explanation that never came. This comparison doesn't feel like jealousy. It feels like confusion. You ask yourself, why are they okay and I'm not? You wonder if you were more emotionally invested, if you were weaker, if there's something wrong with your capacity to let go. You begin to believe that healing has a timeline and that you're already behind. The truth is, this pressure isn't just internal. We live in a world that glamorizes resilience. Social narratives often favor the person who bounced back quickly, who grew from the pain, who turned heartbreak into motivation. And while that story may be true for some, it's incomplete. It leaves out the people who heal slowly, the ones who still cry at the memory long after the other person has moved on, the ones who need more time, more silence, more inner repair before they can even imagine opening up again. Psychologically, this phenomenon is tied to healing disparity, the emotional imbalance that arises when one person in a severed bond appears to recover faster than the other. While their pace may have nothing to do with you, it often feels personal, because the pain you're holding still feels so real, so present, so heavy, and yet, to them, it seems like ancient history. And that disconnect creates a new kind of abandonment, emotional outpacing. You begin to feel like you're grieving alone, as if the story that once involved both of you now only lives in your memory. They're no longer carrying it, and that makes you feel foolish for still holding on. So you start forcing your healing. You minimize your feelings. You avoid certain songs. You pretend it doesn't hurt anymore. You try to catch up to wherever you think they are emotionally. But forced healing doesn't heal anything. It just covers pain in performance. You tell yourself you've moved on, but inside, your mind still replays old conversations. You still wake up with their name lingering at the edge of your thoughts. You still wonder what you could have done differently. And that inner contradiction begins to wear you down, because you're acting like someone who's fine, and no one suspects otherwise. This gap between internal experience and external pressure is where emotional exhaustion sets in. You're not just mourning the loss. You're mourning it quietly, while pretending to be better. And that's a heavy duality to carry. But here's the deeper truth. Healing is not symmetrical. Two people can share the same relationship and experience its ending in completely different ways. What they show on the outside may not reflect what they're managing internally. And even if it does, that doesn't mean your process is wrong. It just means your emotional system needs something different. And that difference isn't a flaw. It's a signal of what makes your emotional world uniquely yours. Maybe you're someone who forms attachments slowly and deeply. Maybe you built a future around that person in your mind, and now you're recalibrating. Maybe you're not just mourning them, but the version of yourself that only existed in that relationship. Maybe your healing is slower because your love was layered, not impulsive, not casual, and therefore, not easily undone. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're thorough. And thorough healing takes time. The problem is, we rarely see this kind of healing modeled. We see highlight reels, quick redemptions, bold reinventions. We rarely see the person sitting alone on a couch, still thinking about someone months after the last message. We rarely hear about the quiet ache that lingers after closure never arrives. And because we don't see it, we assume we're alone in it. But we're not. There are more people than you realize who are still healing from things no one remembers happened. People who never got apologies, who never got clarity, who carry old stories like folded letters in their pockets, unread by others, but too meaningful to throw away. And those people aren't weak. They're not behind. They're moving through grief at a pace that matches the depth of what they lost. And maybe that's you. Maybe you've been telling yourself to move on while your heart is still catching up. Maybe you've been measuring your progress against someone who never looked back. Maybe you've mistaken their speed for emotional maturity and your slowness for failure. But healing is not a race. It's not a public performance. It's not defined by how someone else looks without you. It's defined by how you treat yourself while you're learning how to live without them. So what if, instead of comparing your timeline to theirs, you started asking yourself, what do I still need? What part of me hasn't been comforted yet? What memory am I still holding on to? Not because I want to suffer, but because it hasn't been properly honored. That's where healing begins to shift, not in speed, but in intention. You start choosing rituals that nourish instead of distract. You stop pretending the pain is gone. You give it space to move through you, even if it means revisiting places you tried to avoid. You stop asking, why am I not over this yet? And start asking, what part of this still hurts? And why? And slowly, the comparison fades, because it no longer matters how quickly someone else moved on. What matters is that you are choosing to stay with yourself, to remain present in the parts that feel unfinished, to build closure where none was offered, to repair trust without shortcuts. One day, maybe they'll look back. Maybe they won't. Either way, your healing is not contingent on their recognition. It's built on your willingness to acknowledge what you lost and to keep going anyway, at your own pace, on your own terms. When you watch someone become the person you needed them to be, but for someone else, it's not the heartbreak that hurts the most, not the silence, not the loss, not even the abandonment. What lingers far longer, what cuts deeper in ways you can't quite put into words, is watching someone become the version of themselves you once hoped they'd be. But now, for someone else, you were there for their chaos. You weathered their indecision. You stayed through the late replies, the emotional distance, the unspoken apologies that never came. You were patient through their growing pains, the unfinished healing, the communication breakdowns, the inconsistent affection. You gave them space when they didn't know what they wanted. You tried to understand when they shut down. You adjusted, gave more, held back, held on. You hoped they'd come around, that the person they were capable of being was just waiting under the surface. But eventually, it ended, not necessarily with cruelty, sometimes with silence, sometimes with the soft, non-committal kind of walking away that leaves no real moment of closure. And while you tried to accept it, a part of you still wondered if they'd change, and if so, whether they'd come back different. Then, at some point, weeks, months later, you find out they've changed, but not in the way you imagined. You see them in new photos, hear about them from a mutual friend, or stumble across their life again online. And now, they're present, affectionate, considerate, committed. The same person who once said, "I'm just not ready," is now talking about long-term plans. The one who couldn't communicate is now writing long captions about how grateful they are for someone new. They've become emotionally available, just not for you. And that realization is complicated. It doesn't ignite immediate anger. It brings a quieter kind of grief, the kind that blends sadness with confusion and a sharp sense of replacement. You ask yourself questions you already know are dangerous. Why couldn't they be like that for me? Was I the problem? Did I make it too hard for them to grow? This emotional state is known in psychology as post-relational displacement, the feeling of being emotionally bypassed in someone else's journey of personal development. It's when your presence served as a bridge, but someone else gets to walk across it. When your emotional labor, your understanding, your patience contributed to their growth, but you're not the one who gets to benefit from that growth. And it's almost impossible not to take it personally, even when logic tells you not to, even when you know people evolve on their own timelines, even when you remind yourself that maybe it wasn't the right fit. Still, you wonder, was I just the lesson they had to learn before loving someone else better? The pain intensifies because it's layered with injustice. You weren't just left, you were left right before they became someone capable of staying. You were there during the trial phase, the uncertainty, the testing, and now someone else gets the full version, the finished product, the better communicator, the more thoughtful partner, and you start to feel like you were just part of their practice round. This perception damages more than just your memory of the relationship. It reshapes how you see yourself. You start believing that you're the person people date when they're not ready, that your role is to prepare them for the next chapter, that you're good enough to help someone grow, but not good enough to grow with. That belief is corrosive because it makes you suspicious of future closeness. You begin to question whether your emotional labor has any lasting value, or if you're just the prelude to someone else's love story. You tell yourself that next time, you'll hold back more, expect less, invest less, not because you're bitter, but because you're tired. Tired of planting seeds that bloom in someone else's garden. And yet, underneath that pain, there's something else happening, something even more quietly devastating. You begin to doubt your impact. You begin to believe that if someone only improves after you, it means you didn't matter during. That if they couldn't change for you, maybe you weren't worth changing for. But that's not how growth works. Personal transformation is rarely clean, rarely linear, and rarely fair. Some people need to lose something meaningful before they recognize its value. Some only see their patterns clearly after they've hurt someone they actually cared for. Some are incapable of reflection while still inside the comfort of your patience. For them, awareness comes only once they're forced to see themselves without your forgiveness cushioning the impact. That doesn't make it okay. It just means their timeline had nothing to do with your worth. They didn't become better for someone else because that person is more lovable. They became better because you showed them what love should have felt like, and it stayed with them, even if they couldn't match it in the moment. You were not irrelevant in their growth. You were the mirror, the example, the consequence. And while that may not bring comfort, it brings clarity, because you weren't left behind because you were lacking. You were left behind because they couldn't rise while still leaning on you. Some people only find their balance once they no longer have someone else holding them steady. And unfortunately, that means you weren't chosen for the final chapter. Not because you weren't enough, but because they weren't capable of fully arriving while still living in the version of themselves you knew. So where does that leave you? Still hurting, still healing, still wondering what it means when someone you cared for grows into a better version of themselves, just not with you. And the truth is, it will sting. It will reopen questions you thought were closed. But it will also remind you of the kind of love you offered, the patience you gave, the way you held space for someone else to become more. That capacity, that depth, that doesn't disappear just because they're no longer around to receive it. It stays with you. And eventually, someone will show up who doesn't need a transformation after you. Someone who is already capable of staying, of listening, of meeting you where you are, without asking you to wait while they figure out how to show up. But until then, hold on to the fact that you were not just a stepping stone. You were a catalyst. You were a chapter that mattered, even if it didn't end the way you hoped. When you don't know whether to miss them or be angry they left so easily, there's a strange kind of emotional tug-of-war that takes over after someone leaves you without much explanation. It's not just grief. It's not just heartbreak. It's something harder to name. You miss them, the way they laughed, the way they understood your jokes, the way they made even boring days feel a little softer. But at the very same time, you're furious at how easily they let go, how little effort they made to stay, how simple it seemed for them to detach and move on while you were left behind, trying to make sense of what even happened. This emotional contradiction can make you feel like you're losing your grip. One day you're scrolling through your phone, aching to see their name pop up. The next, you're replaying the moment they stopped trying, and all you feel is heat in your chest. You can't even tell what hurts more, their absence, or the realization that keeping you was never something they fought for. It's not the kind of anger that comes with yelling or confrontation. It's a silent, internal burn, the kind that lingers in quiet places, in the middle of conversations with other people, in the background of your workday, in that moment right before sleep when your mind wanders back to what you wish you'd said. You think of all the things you did to make it work, how much you adjusted, how many things you overlooked, and then you remember that they didn't even try. That's what stings the most. Not just that they left, but how easy it seemed for them to do it. Psychologically, this is known as ambivalent emotional residue, a form of unresolved attachment where the brain cannot organize the emotional memory into one coherent narrative. Instead of feeling fully sad or fully angry, you feel both, simultaneously. And that emotional dissonance creates internal instability, because part of you still longs for them, while another part is screaming, they shouldn't get to be missed. This conflict becomes even harder to process when the relationship didn't end with clear betrayal. They didn't cheat. They didn't scream. They didn't do something obviously cruel. They just faded, walked away, disconnected, without any closure or clear wrongdoing. You're left emotionally suspended. It becomes harder to access your own anger, because there's nothing solid to direct it at. But that doesn't make the anger less real. It just makes it harder to validate. So instead, you suppress it. You lean into nostalgia. You replay the good moments. You remind yourself they weren't all bad. And no, they weren't. But that's not the point. The point is, when it came time to choose, to commit, to face difficulty, they didn't. They let go. And no amount of good memories can justify the ease with which they left you holding the emotional weight alone. What you're really grieving isn't just them. It's the version of yourself who believed you were building something mutual. It's the trust you placed in a bond that ended without warning. It's the vision of a shared future that only existed in your head, while they were already halfway out the door. And still, despite all of this, you miss them. You miss the familiarity, the tone of their voice, the way they fit into your routines, the comfort of knowing someone cared, even if the way they showed it was imperfect. You don't want them back, necessarily, but you want to go back to the version of life where they were still here, still reachable, still within the realm of possibility. And that contradiction can feel shameful. You tell yourself, why am I missing someone who didn't even try to stay? You wonder if missing them means you're weak, if still caring means you haven't grown, if the ache means you're stuck. But here's the truth. Missing someone and resenting how they left can exist at the same time. You don't have to choose between love and anger, between grief and clarity. Your emotional world is complex, and your mind is trying to reconcile two opposing truths. I still feel something for this person, and they didn't treat me in a way that honors those feelings. Both are valid, and until you allow yourself to hold both without judgment, you'll remain caught in emotional limbo. One part of you will keep reaching backward, trying to rewrite the story into something cleaner. The other part will keep yelling from the sidelines, reminding you that you deserve better. That internal war doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're healing, and healing is rarely linear. Some days, you'll feel like you're over it. Others, the smallest reminder will send you spiraling again. This isn't backtracking, it's integration. It's your nervous system slowly learning how to make peace with emotional contradictions. You begin by allowing the anger to speak, not in explosive ways, but honestly. Let it say, I deserved more than silence. Let it whisper, I deserved someone who stayed when it got hard. Let it be heard, so it doesn't have to be hidden, because hidden anger doesn't go away. It just turns inward, into self-blame. into emotional numbness, into delayed grief. Then, allow the part of you that still misses them to have space. 2. Not to glorify them, but to honor your capacity to care. To remember that even in imbalance, your emotions were real. That missing someone doesn't mean you're asking them back into your life. It just means you're human, and part of healing includes mourning the potential that never unfolded. Eventually, the intensity softens. The contradiction doesn't fully disappear, but it becomes more bearable. The longing and the resentment stop pulling you in opposite directions. They settle into a quieter understanding that someone can mean something to you and still not be right for you. That someone can have shared beautiful moments with you and still have failed to show up when it mattered most. And most importantly, that your worth was never diminished by their inability to stay. So no, you don't have to choose between missing them and being angry. You're allowed to feel both. What matters is that you don't let either feeling distort the truth of who you are, someone who showed up, someone who stayed, someone who felt deeply, even when the other person pulled away. And the next time your mind replays that internal argument, the why do I still care, versus the why did they leave so easily, you remind yourself that emotions are not contracts. You're allowed to feel everything without needing to justify any of it, because you're not wrong for missing them, and you're not wrong for being angry either. When you can't tell if you miss the person or just the version of yourself you were around them, there are moments, long after someone has exited your life, when you find yourself missing them. It catches you off guard, a song, a memory, a photo you didn't know was still on your phone. It isn't always painful. Sometimes, it's nostalgic. Other times, it hits with unexpected intensity. But over time, as the rawness fades and the sharp edges of the loss begin to smooth, a different kind of question starts to form, one that's harder to answer. Do I really miss them? Or do I miss who I was when I was with them? That question sits quietly, just under the surface. It comes up when you realize how much lighter you used to feel, how easy it was to laugh, how you used to speak more freely, dream more loudly, move more confidently. Maybe they didn't make you that person, but somehow around them, that version of you was more visible, more alive. And now that they're gone, you're left not only with their absence, but with the absence of that self you once were. This experience is more common than people realize, and it creates a subtle emotional confusion. You find yourself longing for connection, for warmth, for the energy of being seen. But it's not always the person you're longing for. It's the mirror they once held up to you. A mirror that, for whatever reason, reflected back a version of you that felt more complete, more expressive, more whole. Psychologically, this is linked to a phenomenon known as self-concept fragmentation, the disruption of how we understand ourselves when a significant relationship ends. When we're deeply connected to someone, we don't just form memories together. We form a shared identity space. We develop routines, inside jokes, emotional rhythms that feel unique to that dynamic. And within that shared space, a specific version of us emerges, shaped by the energy, feedback, and chemistry of the relationship. It's not inauthentic. It's just relational. But when that connection ends, that version of ourselves often fades with it. And that loss can be incredibly disorienting. Because now, when you try to reconnect with who you were, it doesn't quite work. You try revisiting the music, the conversations, the humor, but it all feels slightly out of reach. Like trying to step back into a room that no longer exists. And that's when the grief becomes less about the person and more about the version of you that only came alive in their presence. This realization brings with it a quieter, more existential kind of ache. Not the heartbreak of rejection, not the pain of missing someone's voice, but the slow mourning of a self you haven't seen in a while. You begin to wonder, was that really me? Or was I only that way because they saw me that way? And if that part of me no longer shows up, does it mean I've lost it? Or worse, was it never truly mine to begin with? These are not easy questions, because they challenge something fundamental. our sense of consistency. We like to believe we know who we are, that we're stable across time and space. But the truth is, many of us are relationally responsive. Certain people bring out sides of us that others never touch. And when they leave, those parts of us don't always follow us forward. This doesn't make us inauthentic. It makes us human, flexible, multifaceted. But when a key person leaves, it can feel like part of our emotional palette goes missing. You start to feel flatter, less expressive, less connected to the version of yourself that felt joyful, creative, spontaneous, alive. And so, you confuse the longing for them with the longing for you. But here's the subtle danger. If you're not careful, that confusion can pull you backward. You might try to recreate the relationship, not because it was healthy or right, but because you're desperate to feel like yourself again. You may even reach out, hoping to revisit a dynamic that no longer exists, all because you miss who you were when they were around. That's why it's so important to pause and ask, what exactly am I grieving here? Is it them, their energy, their presence? Or is it something internal, something about how you felt in yourself when they were in your life? Because if it's the latter, if what you're truly missing is the self you were in their presence, then your path forward isn't about chasing them. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they happen to reflect. You start by identifying what those parts were. Maybe you laughed more. Maybe you took risks. Maybe you felt smarter, more creative, more open. Maybe you were softer, more trusting, more patient. Whatever it was, name it, own it, and then ask, how can I begin to access that part of me again without them as the trigger? Because that version of you didn't belong to them. It wasn't created by them. It was always you. They just brought it to the surface. And now, your work, your real work, is to learn how to bring it to the surface on your own. That doesn't happen overnight. At first, it may feel performative. You may try to force joy, or re-enter hobbies, or revisit old patterns of expression, and they may not feel the same. But with time, those parts of you can return, not as replicas of the past, but as reclaimed traits, fully your own this time. And when they do return, when you start to feel more like yourself again, you'll realize something quietly powerful. You never needed them to access your full self. You only needed to believe you could. So the next time you find yourself missing someone, pause, sit with the memory, let it unfold, and then ask, is it really them I miss? Or is it the way I felt when I was with them? And if the answer is the latter, don't chase the person. Chase the version of you that still exists, waiting, underneath the grief, ready to return. When you stop talking about them because no one understands why you still care, at some point in your grieving, something shifts. Not internally, at first, but socially. In the beginning, people ask how you're doing. They listen. They let you talk about it, the details, the confusion, the pain. You repeat the same stories, and they nod. They say, that sounds hard, or you'll feel better with time. And for a while, it helps. You feel less alone in your ache. You feel like your pain has somewhere to go. But eventually, the responses begin to change. Subtly, less engagement, shorter replies. The well-meaning concern starts turning into quiet discomfort. People stop asking, or if they do, the tone has changed. It's more of a check-in than an invitation. And you start to hear that gentle but unmistakable undertone in their voices. Are you still not over this? It's not that they say it directly. It's in the timing, the quick pivots in conversation, the way they try to brighten the mood too fast, the silence after you mention the person's name, the way they gently remind you to move forward or let go. And slowly, something inside you begins to tighten. You realize that what you're still feeling is no longer acceptable to express. So you stop talking about them, not because you don't still think about them. You do, constantly, but because you've learned that your pain is making others uncomfortable. Because the timeline that society silently enforces has now expired. And because the way you still care, weeks, months, sometimes even years later, doesn't seem to make sense to the people around you anymore. This is one of the loneliest phases of being left behind. The phase where your heartbreak becomes invisible, where the emotional weight is still heavy, but the external support has disappeared. It's not that people don't love you. It's that they don't understand why this still matters. Why someone who walked away still lives in your memory like they never left. Why you still wake up with their name in your chest. Why you still avoid certain songs, certain streets, certain times of year. Psychologically, this is called disenfranchised grief, grief that isn't acknowledged or validated by the people around you. It doesn't fit neatly into socially accepted categories of mourning. You're not grieving a death. You're not going through a divorce. There was no public goodbye, just a quiet ending that left you emotionally suspended. And because it doesn't look like real grief, the world moves on and expects you to do the same. But your mind hasn't caught up. Because this wasn't just about losing a person. It was about losing meaning, losing the imagined future you were building, losing the emotional rhythm you were used to, and most of all, losing the version of yourself that existed in that relationship. That version doesn't just disappear overnight. It lingers, it echoes, and its presence makes you want to talk, to process, to understand, to say out loud, "This still matters to me." But now, you've learned to say it silently. You cry alone. You journal instead of reaching out. You think of responses, but don't send the message. You mention their name in your head, but not in the group chat. You shrink your grief down to something more manageable, not because it's gotten smaller, but because there's no room for it anymore in other people's lives. And that shrinking, it doesn't just affect how you process the loss. It starts to affect how you see yourself. You begin to feel ashamed of your attachment. You start judging your own heart for caring too much, for taking too long. You begin to wonder, is there something wrong with me that I still feel this? That self-doubt is more damaging than the grief itself, because it creates a split, a part of you that still feels everything deeply, and another part that tries to silence those feelings in the name of moving on. But silencing grief doesn't heal it. It only buries it deeper, where it festers, turns to guilt, or numbs you to future connection. And the irony is, the deeper your pain, the quieter it becomes. The more it matters, the less space you're given to express it. And so, you begin to carry it in private. You develop quiet rituals. You revisit conversations in your head. You say things to them that no one else will ever hear. You live with a ghost no one else sees. And eventually, you stop trying to make anyone else see it, because it feels easier to suffer silently than to feel misunderstood one more time. But here's what's true. Your grief doesn't need to be explained to be real. It doesn't need to meet anyone's timeline. It doesn't need to be justified or repackaged to make other people more comfortable. What you're feeling is not weakness. It's not obsession. It's not failure. It's evidence of love. Love that wasn't neatly concluded. Love that didn't get closure. Love that ended. Not because you stopped caring, but because someone else stopped showing up. That kind of love doesn't dissolve on schedule. It lingers. It changes shape. But it doesn't just vanish because the world expects it to. So if you find yourself still thinking about someone, still caring, still grieving, even when no one around you understands why, let this be your reminder. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are just honoring the depth of your own emotional truth. And while others may not understand it, you do. And that's enough. When you keep expecting closure from someone who never needed it themselves, closure is one of those ideas that sounds simple in theory. A conversation, an honest explanation, a clean emotional line between what was and what is. You imagine that if you just understood why it ended, if you knew what changed, what went wrong, what you could have done differently, the pain would start to loosen its grip. But when you've been left behind, and the person who left never feels the need to explain anything at all, you're forced into a different kind of healing, one that doesn't come with clarity, one that doesn't come with fairness, one that you have to build for yourself while still hoping, somewhere deep inside, that they'll one day come back and fill in the blanks. And the hardest part is that they don't look back. They don't offer insight. They don't ask how you're doing or whether you got the answers you were looking for. Because for them, it's over. They've filed it away. They moved on, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't feel a need to stay in the wreckage. But you're still there, still scanning the emotional floor for pieces that will help you understand how something that once felt safe became silence. This kind of psychological disorientation is known as ambiguous loss, when the person is physically gone, but emotionally unresolved. There's no conclusion, no final conversation, just an invisible wall where a connection used to be. And the brain doesn't know how to make peace with that. It keeps asking, what happened? Over and over, because it's wired to close loops, to understand cause and effect. But closure isn't possible when someone exits without providing the meaning you need. So you start building your own theories. You analyze old messages. You revisit conversations. You try to remember whether there were signs. You obsess over whether you missed something, a look, a word, a shift in tone that now feels obvious in hindsight. And in the process, you start rewriting the story, not because it brings comfort, but because your mind needs something to hold on to in the absence of actual explanation. But there's a danger in this search, the belief that if you just found the right reason, the pain would stop, that if you just understood, you could let go. So you keep waiting for the day they'll reach out and say, here's what really happened, waiting for an apology that feels sincere, for an answer that validates how much it hurt. And in the meantime, your healing is suspended, not because you're weak, but because you're stuck in a loop your nervous system can't close without cooperation. You try to move on. You distract yourself. You act like it doesn't matter. But the absence still hums beneath everything, a question with no answer, a wound with no stitching. What makes this kind of grief even harder is that most people around you don't understand it. They say things like, just let it go, or you don't need closure from them, give it to yourself. And while they mean well, they don't see the complexity. They don't see that your pain isn't just about loss. It's about confusion, about being emotionally abandoned without context. And that lack of clarity becomes its own kind of trauma, one that makes it harder to trust your perception of relationships going forward. Because if someone could leave you that easily, without explanation, what does that say about all the connections you believed were solid? This doubt doesn't just stay in your past. It begins to follow you into new relationships. You start second-guessing the stability of people who show up. You don't know how to interpret affection. You fear that at any moment, the person across from you might simply decide they're done, without warning, without reason, just like the last one did. And so, the lack of closure doesn't just keep you tethered to the past. It begins to distort your ability to feel safe in the present. But eventually, slowly, and often out of necessity, you begin to realize something else. You've been waiting for someone who was never waiting with you. You've been holding a door open for a person who already walked away. You've been putting your healing on pause, hoping someone else will press play. And they won't. Not because they don't care. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. But either way, their emotional process is not built around the same needs. They didn't need closure to leave. They didn't need understanding to move on. They weren't looking for a final chapter, because for them, the book was already closed. That's what finally hurts enough to break the spell. The realization that they aren't coming back to help you finish the story. That the responsibility of peace has fallen entirely into your own hands. And that's when real healing begins. Not when you get the explanation, but when you stop chasing it. You begin to create meaning from within. You say to yourself, I don't know why they left the way they did. I may never know, but I still get to decide what happens now. You start asking different questions, not why did they do this, but what am I learning about myself through this? You build closure not as a perfect understanding, but as an act of self-restoration. You begin to affirm that not every relationship ends with fairness. Not every connection is honored in the way it deserves to be. Not every person is capable of offering the depth you needed from them. And that doesn't make you foolish. That makes you human. So no, you may never get the final conversation. You may never hear the real reason. You may never receive the kind of goodbye you deserved. But you can still stop waiting. You can stop placing your peace in someone else's hands. You can choose to finish the story for yourself, even if the ending is messy, even if it doesn't make sense, even if the only thing you're sure of is that you deserved better than silence. And that knowing, that's the closure, even if they never give it to you. When you start wondering if they ever felt the same depth you did, one of the most disorienting feelings after being left behind isn't just the emptiness. It's the doubt. Not about what happened, but about what it meant. You begin to question whether what you felt was ever shared. You ask yourself, sometimes daily, did they really feel it too? Or was I the only one who thought this was something real? This question isn't just painful, it's destabilizing, because it forces you to reevaluate every memory. You find yourself revisiting moments that once felt full of meaning, the way they looked at you across the room, the things they said late at night, the way they held your hand in silence. You start asking, was that real? Or was I just seeing what I wanted to see? The idea that someone could stand in front of you, say the right words, smile the right smile, and still walk away like none of it mattered, creates a kind of emotional vertigo. You begin to feel like your own perception can't be trusted. If they could seem so present and still leave so effortlessly, then what else were you wrong about? This confusion taps into something deeper than heartbreak. It strikes at the core of your ability to trust your own emotional experience. Because if you were truly connected, if they felt what you felt, then how could they let it go so easily? And yet they did. They moved on. They didn't reach back. They didn't express confusion or remorse. And the longer that silence stretches out, the more convinced you become that maybe it was never real for them to begin with. Psychologically, this state is known as emotional asymmetry anxiety, the distress caused when one person is unsure whether their emotional depth in a relationship was reciprocated. It often follows experiences of sudden detachment, ghosting, or emotionally vague breakups. When someone leaves without clear explanation, your mind doesn't just grieve, it interrogates. You start reprocessing the entire relationship through a new lens. Was I alone in this the whole time? And that's a crushing thought, because it rewrites everything. It turns intimacy into illusion. It turns warmth into performance. It makes you feel foolish, like you were playing a game no one else was playing, like you invested in something the other person never truly believed in. This kind of uncertainty is corrosive. It doesn't just sit in your mind. It seeps into your body. You feel it in the tension in your chest, in the way your thoughts race before sleep, in the sickening drop in your stomach when you see their name unexpectedly. You're not just missing them, you're missing certainty. You're missing the reassurance that what you gave wasn't wasted, that your emotions weren't misplaced, that you weren't alone in your depth. Over time, this leads to a quieter kind of pain, not the pain of loss, but the pain of self-doubt. You begin questioning your own ability to read people. You start second-guessing what connection is supposed to feel like. You wonder if you misinterpret intensity for intimacy, if maybe you get attached too easily, if maybe you're just built differently, too emotionally tuned in, too sensitive, too hopeful. And yet, deep down, you still believe in what you felt, even as you try to forget, even as you silence the memories. There's a part of you that still holds on to it, because it did feel real. It did feel mutual, at least in those moments. And no matter how it ended, that truth doesn't just disappear. But how do you reconcile the feeling that something was real with the reality that the other person left without explanation, without struggle, without ever confirming what it meant to them? You begin, slowly, by separating what happened from what it meant. Their leaving doesn't erase the connection. Their silence doesn't rewrite the memories. Their detachment doesn't mean you imagined everything. People leave for all kinds of reasons: fear, timing, emotional unavailability, personal wounds. Their exit may reflect more about their inner world than it does about what you shared. And yet, the doubt still lingers. Because closure isn't just about endings, it's about meaning. And when no one gives you meaning, your mind tries to fill in the blanks. Unfortunately, it tends to fill them with the harshest conclusions. They never loved me. It was all in my head. I was just convenient. But those aren't facts. Those are wounds trying to protect you from ambiguity. Because ambiguity is hard to live with. It's easier to believe it meant nothing than to believe it meant something, and they still chose to walk away. But here's the difficult truth. Two people can feel something real and still end up with different conclusions. You can both share moments that mattered. You can both be moved, changed, affected, and still, one person might walk away, while the other stays in the memory. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means your emotional processes weren't identical. Your depth doesn't disappear just because they didn't stay long enough to match it. Over time, your healing won't come from finding out how they felt. It will come from accepting that you felt something important. And that's enough. You experienced love, presence, hope. You showed up with vulnerability, with intention, with care. And that says everything about you, not about the person who left. So when your mind starts replaying those memories, when it whispers, maybe it wasn't real for them, try responding with something gentler. It was real for me. And that's worth honoring. Because even if they never say it, even if you never get confirmation, even if they forget every moment, you remember. And that memory belongs to you, not as a delusion, but as evidence that your heart was fully alive. When you try to be friends after, but realize you're the only one still holding on. Sometimes, when a relationship ends, especially one that wasn't chaotic or cruel, the temptation to stay in touch feels natural. You tell each other it doesn't have to be awkward. You say, let's still be friends. Maybe you even mean it. Maybe it feels like the only way to keep something intact after watching everything else fall apart. You don't want to erase them. You don't want to feel like strangers. So you try. You keep them on your contact list. You still like their posts. You might even text them casually from time to time. And for a while, it feels manageable. You tell yourself, we're being mature. You believe that staying in each other's lives, even in a reduced capacity, is better than cutting all ties. But then something changes. Slowly, subtly. They stop responding as often, or their messages feel more distant, more polite than warm. They don't initiate. You're always the one reaching out. You send something funny and get a thumbs up. You mention a shared memory and get silence. You wish them well on something important, and they say thanks, but that's it. No questions, no curiosity, just polite disengagement. And that's when the realization creeps in. This friendship isn't mutual. You're not just trying to maintain a connection. You're holding on to a thread they already let go of. You're still emotionally tethered to a story they've filed away as complete. And that realization isn't just disappointing. It's destabilizing. Because now, even your attempt at friendship feels like a performance. One where you're pretending to be okay with less, just to keep them around in any form. Psychologically, this is referred to as emotional bargaining, the phase of grief where you unconsciously lower your expectations in hopes of salvaging what's left. It's not an intentional lie. It's a survival instinct. You tell yourself that if you just stay in their life in some way, it won't feel like a full loss. But deep down, you know the dynamic has changed. The energy isn't the same. You're no longer being met where you are. And that mismatch begins to take a toll. You start crafting your texts more carefully, trying not to sound too emotional. You hesitate before reaching out. You pretend not to notice the growing distance. But you do. You notice everything. The delays, the vagueness, the sense that you're now a background character in their life, while there's still a central one in yours. This uneven emotional investment isn't just sad. It creates internal shame. You start to feel embarrassed. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you realize, often too late, that you're showing up for someone who's only tolerating your presence. And that's a hard truth to sit with. You try to rationalize it. You say they're busy, that this is how people drift, that maybe they're still figuring things out too. But the reality becomes clearer each time the effort is one-sided. They're not confused. They've simply moved on and didn't have the words, or maybe the courage, to tell you that explicitly. So you're left navigating a non-friendship disguised as a friendship, one where every interaction reminds you not of closeness, but of absence. And that kind of quiet rejection cuts deep, because it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not final. It's just slowly eroding your dignity, one unanswered message at a time. And still, you hesitate to walk away, because leaving now feels like losing them all over again. It feels like confirming what you already feared, that they were never planning to stay, that the friendship was a temporary buffer, not a real intention. So you wait, you shrink your presence, you tell yourself you're okay with less. But inside, something begins to ache in a new way, not from heartbreak, but from the realization that you're betraying yourself just to avoid accepting that they're gone. That's the moment where healing can begin, when you stop trying to be someone who's fine with being friends and start being honest about what you actually need. When you admit that this half connection isn't enough, that pretending not to care is costing you your peace. That staying close to someone who's already emotionally gone is not a form of maturity. It's a form of self-abandonment. So you face the grief you've been postponing. The second wave, the one that comes not from the breakup itself, but from the understanding that even the friendship wasn't real. You grieve the version of you who thought this could work, who thought you were strong enough to watch them move on while you stayed behind, who thought that by keeping them in your life, you were keeping something sacred intact. But now, you know better. Now, you can let go, not because you no longer care, but because you care enough about yourself to stop accepting crumbs. And when you finally stop reaching out, when you finally choose silence over performance, you'll feel something unexpected, clarity. Clarity that this isn't how friendships feel. Clarity that your value isn't defined by how long you hold on after someone lets go. Clarity that walking away from someone who's already walked ahead isn't failure, it's self-respect. And in that clarity, you may also find something else. Space. Space for new connections that don't require performance. Space for friendships that aren't built on emotional leftovers. Space to return to yourself, the version that existed before you tried to convince someone else to stay in a role they had no intention of playing. And in that space, you'll heal. Not quickly, not painlessly, but honestly. And that's enough. When you start measuring every new connection against the one that left, moving on doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like trying to talk to someone new, trying to let someone in, trying to be present in a conversation when your mind keeps drifting to someone else, someone from before, someone who left without staying long enough to explain why. And now, whether you mean to or not, you find yourself measuring everyone else against them. It starts small. You notice how this new person laughs, and it doesn't sound like theirs. You hear a word choice that feels unfamiliar. You reach for a joke you once shared and realize the person in front of you won't get it. And something in you recoils, not because the new person is doing anything wrong, but because your mind is still wired to expect the old rhythm, the old connection, the old familiarity. This comparison isn't deliberate. You're not doing it to sabotage anything. You want to move on. You want to feel close to someone again. But every time you start, there's a gap between what you remember and what's actually happening, between the warmth you once felt and the awkwardness of starting over. Psychologically, this is called emotional anchoring, when your emotional reference point becomes so deeply tied to one person that it distorts how you perceive everyone else. Your nervous system memorizes the way things used to feel, the tone, the cadence, the level of attention, and anything that deviates from that script, even if it's healthy, even if it's kind, feels wrong. Not because it is, but because it's unfamiliar. And so, new connections begin to feel dull by comparison. You don't feel the same spark. You don't get the same butterflies. You wonder if something's wrong with them, with you, with the idea of connection itself. You find yourself saying, I don't know, it's just not the same. And you're right, it's not. But that doesn't mean it's not good. It just means it hasn't had the chance to become meaningful yet, because you're still measuring it against something that no longer exists. This is where emotional memory becomes both a comfort and a trap. You remember what once worked, and it helps you recognize what mattered. But it also limits your openness to something different. You start to believe that unless it feels exactly like that, it's not worth exploring. And that belief keeps you stuck, chasing a ghost, while turning away from possibilities right in front of you. But it's not just the emotional imprint you're comparing. It's yourself, too. You remember how you were in that old connection, more relaxed, more open, maybe even more confident. You start to feel like you're performing around new people, like you're only half there, like you're trying too hard or not enough. And it frustrates you, because you know you're capable of deep connection. You've had it before. You just don't know how to recreate it from scratch without feeling fake. So you retreat. Not all the way, but enough. You stay polite. You respond to messages. You agree to meet. But inside, you're guarded. You're cautious. You're half committed. Not because you don't want love again, but because you're afraid of settling for something less. Or worse, getting hurt again by something that seems real and ends up evaporating like the last time. And that fear is real. It's not paranoia. It's muscle memory. It's your body remembering what it felt like to be left behind. To give your best to someone and still end up alone. To trust too soon and regret it. So now, even when someone shows genuine interest, you can't help but wonder, will this end the same way? That inner tension between hope and fear keeps you in limbo. You want to move forward, but your heart is still scanning for similarities. Still asking, do they make me feel like they did? And the truth is no one will. Because no one can. That connection was unique. It was specific. It was shaped by time, by circumstance, by emotional chemistry that won't be repeated in exactly the same way. But here's what's also true. Just because something isn't the same doesn't mean it's lesser. Different doesn't mean worse. Unfamiliar doesn't mean unsafe. Sometimes the healthiest connection isn't the one that gives you an instant rush. It's the one that builds slowly, quietly, without chaos. It's the one that doesn't demand you abandon yourself. The one that respects your pace. The one that doesn't rush you into pretending you're ready when you're not. But to recognize that kind of connection, you have to let go of the measuring stick. You have to stop asking new people to replicate a feeling that belonged to a different version of you. You have to start meeting people with curiosity instead of comparison. That doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean erasing the past. It means making space for new possibilities. Ones that might look and feel nothing like what came before, but still have their own kind of beauty. You'll know you're healing when you stop needing new connections to remind you of someone else, and start appreciating them for who they are, not for how closely they match your memory of love. And maybe, the next time someone makes you laugh, you won't compare it to their laugh. Maybe you'll just let it be what it is. A moment, a beginning, an honest attempt at something new. When you start pretending you never cared, just to protect what's left of your dignity. There's a specific kind of silence that comes after loss. Not the quiet that brings peace, but the kind you force into existence, just so you don't have to feel exposed. You stop talking about them. You stop bringing up memories. You laugh when people joke about how you're better off. You play along. You act like it didn't mean that much, like it was just a passing connection. A short chapter, something you moved on from quickly, cleanly, effortlessly. But deep down, you know that's not the truth. You remember everything, the exact moment you knew you were falling, the way your chest felt when you saw their name light up your phone, the conversations that made you feel known in ways few ever have. You still think about those moments, still wonder where it went wrong, still replay it when no one's looking. But to the outside world, and even to the person who left, you keep the performance alive. You act indifferent, unbothered, like they were just a small part of a much bigger story you've already forgotten. And for a while, that story protects you. It helps you hold your head up. It gives you something to cling to when people ask if you're okay. You get good at saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. It wasn't that serious." You smile through it. You convince even yourself. Sometimes. But underneath that armor is something fragile, something still hurting, still questioning, still stuck in the place where things ended without proper closure. Psychologically, this behavior is part of emotional suppression through self-image preservation, a coping mechanism where we minimize or erase the emotional weight of a past experience in order to maintain our pride. Especially when we feel abandoned, this becomes a form of protection. If we can't get back the person, we at least want to protect our dignity. So we rewrite the narrative. We go from "I love them" to "it wasn't that deep." From "I miss them" to "they weren't that special." From "that hurt me" to "I saw it coming." And yet, there's always a crack in the performance. A moment of truth that slips through the mask. You hear a song. You pass a place. You see their name. And suddenly, everything comes back. Not just the emotion, but the weight of all the words you never said. The truth you've been swallowing. The softness you've buried under sarcasm and distance. It's not weakness that makes this happen. It's memory. It's the undeniable fact that some people don't just leave your life, they leave imprints. And pretending you don't care doesn't erase the imprint. It just means you're carrying it in silence. Over time, that silence becomes suffocating, because you're not just hiding the pain from others, you're hiding it from yourself. You start to feel disconnected, not only from the past, but from your own emotional world. You wonder why nothing feels real anymore, why every interaction feels a little hollow, why you're always slightly numb. And the truth is, you can't selectively suppress emotions. When you shut down love, you shut down other feelings too: joy, openness, vulnerability, depth. You start operating in survival mode. You're not really living, you're just protecting. But at some point, the weight of pretending gets heavier than the weight of honesty. And that's when something breaks. It might be quiet, a private journal entry, a moment in the shower, a tear during a conversation you didn't expect to matter. But suddenly, you feel it again: the rawness, the truth, the fact that you did care, that it did matter, that it still does. And in that moment, a different kind of healing begins. Not the kind that hides behind detachment, but the kind that honors what was real. You stop shaming yourself for feeling deeply. You stop pretending that distance equals strength. You realize that caring wasn't the mistake, it was the most honest thing you did. Because what you're really afraid of isn't that they left. It's that they left and didn't care as much as you did. And admitting how much you cared feels like giving them power. But here's the truth they don't tell you enough. Caring isn't weakness. Pretending not to care is. Caring and still choosing to let someone go, that's strength. Caring and being honest about it, that's integrity. Caring, even when it hurts, that's proof you're alive, that your heart is still working, that you haven't closed yourself off to the world. So you begin to let yourself tell the truth. Maybe not to everyone, maybe not all at once, but little by little, you stop running from your own tenderness. You say, "Yes, it mattered." You say, "Yes, I miss them." You say, "No, I haven't fully moved on." Not to reopen the story, not to chase them, but to reclaim your narrative. Because the truth you speak, even when it's uncomfortable, is more powerful than any silence you perform. And slowly, as you stop pretending, you begin reconnecting with yourself, with others, with your capacity to feel something new, something real, something that doesn't require you to hide behind irony or act like your heart was never involved. And when that happens, dignity returns, not because you pretended nothing happened, but because you honored that something did, and you walked through it with your integrity intact. When you keep rehearsing what you'd say if they ever came back, you're not planning for it to happen. You're not delusional. You know they're gone. You've seen the signs, the silence, the new beginnings, the distance that no longer pretends to be temporary. And yet, in the quiet moments, in the parts of the day no one else sees, you still find yourself rehearsing. Not for a confrontation, not even for closure, but for the chance, the tiny, imagined chance that they'll one day appear again, that you'll run into them by accident, that they'll call, message, send something vague enough for you to ask, why now? And in those moments, when your mind is allowed to wander, you play out the script. You imagine what you'd say, not because you need to win, but because you need to be understood. Because even though time has passed, there's still so much left unsaid. You think about the version of yourself you were when it ended, shocked, maybe desperate, maybe confused, and you want to rewrite that ending. You want them to see you now, more clear-eyed, more grounded, more articulate. You want them to hear the words that got stuck in your throat when everything was falling apart. So you rehearse, sometimes in your head, sometimes out loud, sometimes in notes on your phone you'll never send. You craft the perfect sentences, the balance of honesty and strength. You picture their face softening as you speak. You imagine them listening, really listening, as you finally say what you've carried for too long. Psychologically, this is known as imagined resolution rehearsal, a form of mental processing where the brain seeks to resolve emotional ambiguity by playing out hypothetical conversations. It's not weakness. It's regulation. It's your mind's way of organizing chaos into meaning. When you didn't get closure in real life, your imagination steps in to create one. But over time, the rehearsal becomes something more than a mental exercise. It becomes a ritual, a quiet comfort, a way of staying tethered to the version of yourself that still wants to be heard, that still believes there's something left to express, not for reconciliation, but for release. And that's where the sadness deepens, because the more clearly you picture the conversation, the more real it feels. And the more real it feels, the harder it is to accept that it may never happen, that no matter how much growth you experience, no matter how ready you are now to say the right thing, they may never come back to listen. They may never get to see the person you became in the aftermath of their silence. They may never hear the apology you no longer need, but still wish they'd offer. And they may never respond to the words you've practiced so many times they've become part of your emotional reflex. That realization is crushing, not because the door is closed, but because you finally understand that you've been holding it open, quietly, just in case. But here's the deeper truth. The version of them you're rehearsing for may no longer exist. People change. Memory distorts. Your mental image of them is a mix of who they were and who you hoped they'd become. And now, the person you're preparing to speak to might be just that, a preparation, not a reality. And yet, even knowing this, you keep practicing, because the script isn't really for them. It never was. It's for you. It's for the part of you that needs to hear your own truth spoken out loud. The part of you that still holds shame or regret or confusion. The part of you that needs to know, even if no one else ever hears it, that you have something worth saying, that you mattered, that the ending wasn't the whole story. And so, eventually, the rehearsal changes. It becomes less about what you'd say to them, and more about what you need to hear from yourself. You start replacing imagined responses with self-validation. You begin saying things like, I did my best, or I was brave enough to care, or even if they never come back, I am still worth returning to. And that shift from outward to inward is where healing begins. You stop hoping they'll reappear so you can say what you need to. You start saying it now, in whatever form you can: journaling, talking to a friend, standing in front of a mirror, and finally letting the words out. Because if they were meant to hear them, they would have stayed. And if they don't, that doesn't make your voice any less real. It just means it's time to stop waiting for someone else to validate the things you already know. that you loved with intention, that you showed up, even when they didn't, that you stayed soft, even when you were breaking, and most of all, that your story continues, even if they never return to hear the next chapter. So maybe, one day, you'll stop rehearsing altogether, not because you don't care anymore, but because you finally understand you don't need them to come back for your truth to be complete. When you catch yourself smiling at a memory, then remember they're not yours anymore. It always starts unexpectedly. You're not trying to think about them. You've got other things on your mind: work, errands, small distractions. You've learned, mostly, how to keep your days full enough to stay ahead of the ache. And yet, in the middle of all this ordinary life, something breaks through. A smell, a laugh from across the street, a melody that used to hum quietly in the background of a shared Sunday. And without warning, you're remembering, not with pain, not at first, not with longing or heartbreak or anger, just a simple, honest, almost innocent smile. The kind of smile that comes from remembering how something used to feel: light, warm, real. It could be something small. The way they always had to touch every object in a store before choosing one. The way they whispered your name differently when they were sleepy. The silly argument you had about the best way to cook pasta. Or how they used to get distracted mid-sentence and start a new thought without finishing the last. These details rise without effort, like your mind still believes those moments are accessible. And for just a second, a small, suspended moment, it feels like they still belong to you. That memory, that connection, that version of reality where the two of you still orbit the same emotional world. But then something shifts. You remember where you are, who you are now. You remember that they are no longer part of this current story, that their life has continued without you in it, that your name isn't in their recent messages or weekend plans, that the laugh you used to know better than your own doesn't echo down your hallway anymore. And that's when the smile fades, not because the memory itself changed, but because you suddenly remember they're not yours anymore, and you aren't theirs. Psychologically, this moment touches something deep, a phenomenon known as emotional dissonance in memory consolidation. Your brain stores memories based on emotional significance. But when the emotional landscape changes, when a person who once brought you joy becomes a source of pain or absence, your system struggles to process the contradiction. The memory still feels warm, but its presence now triggers cold reality. And your nervous system doesn't quite know which way to turn. So you often find yourself caught in the middle, between a smile and a sigh, between gratitude and grief. This is what makes healing so complicated. People talk about closure as if it's a switch, as if the moment you accept that someone is gone, your body follows suit. But memory doesn't obey logic. You can know, with every rational part of your mind, that someone has moved on, that you should, too, and still find yourself emotionally arrested by a song, a scent, a street corner that holds too much of what once was. And the most disorienting part? Sometimes, it doesn't even hurt at first. Sometimes, it feels good to remember. Safe, even. Like you've found a way to hold onto something meaningful without needing to relive the loss. But then the wave comes, not of sadness, necessarily, but of disconnection. Because the person you shared that memory with is no longer remembering it with you. And that's the hardest part. The loneliness that sneaks in after the nostalgia. The recognition that while you're still holding these little pieces, they may have already let them go. That what was once shared has now become a private archive, one they no longer visit. That you're the sole guardian of moments that were built for two. And that realization, more than anything, makes you feel left behind all over again. But here's something no one says out loud. The fact that you can still remember something kindly, even after it ended, is not a weakness. It's not foolishness. It's not regression. It's proof that your love was real, that your joy was not conditional, that even after all that's been lost, the light still lives somewhere inside you. You are allowed to smile at what once was, even if it no longer exists. even if they're with someone else. Even if they wouldn't think twice about those same memories today. Because the memory didn't belong to them alone. It was yours, too. And just because they stopped carrying it, doesn't mean you have to pretend it was meaningless. And yet, that doesn't mean you have to cling to it either. One of the hardest lessons in grief is learning how to hold something gently enough that it doesn't control you, but tightly enough that it still honors what it meant. Not every good memory needs to be followed by pain, and not every beautiful moment needs to be turned bitter just to justify the ending. Sometimes we taint our own past just to protect ourselves from it. We rewrite stories as painful to make it easier to walk away. We convince ourselves it was all toxic, all flawed, all broken, just to avoid the quiet truth that some of it was really, really good, and that the goodness didn't stop existing just because the relationship did. But this too is healing, letting the memory breathe, allowing yourself to remember without punishing yourself for feeling, smiling, without rushing to suppress it with sarcasm or resentment, knowing that even if they're not yours anymore, you are still yours, and your memories, your kindness, your tenderness, your capacity to love didn't walk away with them. Over time, you may even begin to build new memories in the same spaces. You'll hear the song again, and it will still remind you of them, but maybe it will also remind you of something you've learned, something you've reclaimed. Maybe you'll visit that street again, but this time you'll be walking it alone, not lonely, but whole. Because the goal isn't to erase the past. The goal is to integrate it, to let it become part of your story, not the whole story. And the moment you realize that, the moment you catch yourself smiling at a memory and choose not to flinch, that's when you begin to heal. Not because the memory stopped hurting, but because you stopped fearing what it meant to remember. Because now, the smile doesn't have to be followed by guilt. Now, you can say, yes, that happened. It was beautiful. And it's over. And I'm still here. And one day, without rehearsal, without effort, you'll find yourself smiling at something new. And this time, you won't be pulled backward. You'll just smile and keep going. When you finally start feeling okay, and then they reach out, healing doesn't arrive all at once. It's slow, layered, reluctant. Some days you forget to think about them, and it surprises you. Other days, the ache is still there, but it's quieter, less sharp, more like background static. Eventually, you go entire afternoons, maybe even full weekends, without mentally circling back to the same questions. The ones about why they left, or what you could have done differently, or whether they ever truly cared. It's subtle at first. A little more lightness, a little more breath. A conversation where you don't compare the other person to them. A night where you don't dream about going back. You start sleeping better, laughing without flinching, accepting the silence. Your world doesn't feel so hollow. The version of yourself that once felt lost begins to reassemble. Not all at once, but piece by piece. You're not over it. You're just becoming okay. And then, when you least expect it, they come back. Maybe not with flowers. Maybe not with regret or explanations. But with something. A message. A comment. A like on a post you forgot you shared. Something that, on the surface, is small, but in your chest, it lands like a tremor. Because now, all the time you spent stitching yourself back together is suddenly under review. Your brain floods with activity. What do they want? Why now? Are they thinking about me? Do they miss me? Are they trying to come back? You reread the message. You analyze the punctuation. You stare at it too long. You pretend it doesn't matter, but it does, because they knew how to disappear. And now they've reminded you that they also know how to return. But this isn't just about them. It's about you and the fragile balance you've fought to build. The inner scaffolding you've spent months tightening. The still soft edges of your healing. And suddenly, their name on your screen feels like a test. Of your progress. Of your dignity. Of your heart. Psychologically, this is known as emotional rupture reactivation, when an unexpected interaction reactivates dormant emotional patterns. especially after relational trauma or unprocessed loss. Your mind had begun to file the connection under past, but now it's being pulled back into the present, and your nervous system doesn't know whether to brace, hope, or shut down entirely. So you freeze, not just outwardly, internally. You stare at the message and feel like the clock has stopped. And in a way, it has, because for a while, your healing depended on the absence being uninterrupted. You weren't just healing from them. You were healing from the way they exited, the way they made you feel unimportant, replaceable, forgettable. You were learning how to live without the need for answers. And now, their reappearance threatens to reopen questions you'd finally stopped asking. You want to be strong. You want to shrug it off, to ignore them, to say, I don't care. But something in you still does, not because you want them back, but because they were a chapter you didn't get to finish, a story that ended mid-sentence. And now they're offering you a comma, or maybe a question mark, and you don't know what to do with it. The people around you might offer advice. Don't respond. They're just bored. Or, this is your chance, ask them why. Or, be careful. This is how they get back in. But none of that advice touches the real conflict inside you. Because this isn't about strategy. It's about grief. The grief of someone returning not with love, but with ambiguity. Not with clarity, but with just enough presence to disrupt your peace. And now you're stuck in between again. Half of you wants to know why they reached out. The other half is terrified that the answer won't be satisfying, that it'll only prove what you already fear, that it was never as deep for them as it was for you, that you were easy to forget, that this is just convenience, not correction. So you begin negotiating with yourself. You write replies and delete them. You rehearse what you'd say if you had the courage. You imagine how they might respond. You think about showing them how much better you're doing. You think about ignoring them completely. You imagine both choices, and neither one feels perfect. Because both require you to grieve something else. Either the fantasy that they've changed or the fantasy that they ever will. This is the most delicate kind of healing, the kind that happens in the aftermath of an interruption, when closure was beginning to settle in, and now the door is cracked open again. Not because you wanted it to be, but because they knocked. And what you realize slowly, painfully, is that your healing isn't about what they do next. It's about what you do now. Because they may not offer answers. They may not apologize. They may not stay. They may not even follow up after this message. It might have been a moment of boredom, a flicker of guilt, a nostalgic impulse with no intention behind it. And yet it's you who's left sitting with the emotional weight. But here's where you reclaim your power. You realize that just because someone returns doesn't mean you have to reopen yourself. You realize that curiosity doesn't have to equal access. You realize that missing someone doesn't mean they belong back in your life. And most importantly, you realize that even though they interrupted your healing, they don't get to define it. You get to decide what this moment means. Maybe you respond with kindness, but distance. Maybe you ignore it altogether. Maybe you reply, not with hope, but with honesty, telling them how their absence affected you, without asking them to fix it. Or maybe you say nothing, and that silence becomes your closure. There is no right answer, only the one that protects your peace. Because if their return sends you back into uncertainty, if it pulls you away from your center, if it opens old wounds, you have the right to walk away again. Not because you're bitter, but because you've worked too hard to become whole again. You've had enough unfinished endings. You don't need another one disguised as a new beginning. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not even soon, you'll realize something else. The message wasn't the test. Your response was the answer. And in that moment, you'll know how far you've come. Not because they came back, but because you no longer need them to stay. When you realize you're no longer waiting for them to come back, there's no announcement, no grand moment, no specific day you mark on the calendar, but somewhere between remembering and forgetting, between grief and growth, it happens. You wake up and realize you didn't think about them yesterday. Not once, Not when you brewed your morning coffee. Not when that familiar song played in the background. Not when you passed the place where you used to sit and talk about things you thought were permanent. They didn't come to mind. And even when you do think of them now, it's different. The thought no longer burns. It doesn't pull you into a spiral. It doesn't demand your energy or force your heart to catch up. It's just there. Quiet. Still. Unthreatening. You don't reach for your phone to check if they posted something. You don't scan their name when you scroll through your messages. You don't daydream about running into them or rehearse conversations that will never happen. Something in you, something you didn't know was still holding on, has quietly let go. And with that letting go comes a deep, strange stillness. Not silence, not absence, not even relief. Just space. An internal quiet you didn't know you were capable of having again. You are no longer waiting. Not for an apology. Not for closure. Not for explanation. And not for them to come back. At first, this realization may feel anticlimactic. You spent so long wrapped up in their absence, longing, resisting, revisiting, that you expected healing to feel more dramatic. Like a mountain you'd finally summit. Like a door you'd slam shut. But instead, it feels like standing in a hallway and noticing you've stopped looking toward the door at all. And maybe that's what real healing is, not the loud end, but the quiet turn away. Psychologically, this shift is known as cognitive deactivation, when your mind begins releasing an emotional focus that once dominated your internal landscape. It's not suppression. It's not avoidance. It's not denial. It's the natural unwinding of attachment that no longer has anywhere to go. And it doesn't mean you no longer care. It just means you're no longer attached to the outcome. You no longer need them to explain why they left. You no longer need to prove to yourself that you mattered. You no longer need to pretend it didn't hurt, or that it meant less than it did. You're simply not waiting anymore. And that changes everything. Because so much of the pain of being left behind doesn't just come from loss. It comes from the suspension, from being caught between two realities, the one that was, and the one that never got to be. It comes from holding your breath, hoping they'll return, so you can finally exhale and tell yourself the story was worth it. But you've started breathing again, without them. And now, you're building new things, not just externally, but internally. A sense of self not based on how someone else saw you. An identity not shaped by their preferences, their attention, their approval. You're remembering who you were before them, or discovering someone new entirely. Someone wiser, more grounded, more honest. It didn't happen overnight. There were days you thought you'd never get here. Days when the silence felt louder than anything they ever said. Days when you'd open your phone just to close it again. Days when you convinced yourself that healing was impossible. But those days passed. You kept moving, even when it felt pointless. Even when you had to drag yourself through each hour. And that movement, slow, halting, exhausted, brought you here. To this moment, this clarity, this unexpected freedom. And now, when their name crosses your mind, you feel something you never expected, neutrality. Not resentment, not longing, just neutrality. You remember them, but you no longer romanticize them. You recall the good times, but you don't use them as evidence that they should still be here. You acknowledge the pain, but you don't build a home inside of it. You don't shrink when someone mentions them. You don't ache when someone asks what happened. You don't twist their memory into either a villain or a hero. They were just a person, significant. Yes, but not defining. And in that rebalancing, you regain yourself. You start to notice how much energy you have now that you're no longer emotionally budgeting for their return. You start to feel joy without guilt. You laugh without checking for shadows. You open yourself slowly, cautiously, to new people, new moments, new versions of love that aren't tethered to the past. And one day, maybe even today, you realize something else. You're grateful they came into your life, and just as grateful they left, because as much as it hurt, their absence gave you space to grow. You had to face the parts of yourself that clung too tightly. You had to meet the parts that feared being alone. You had to hold yourself during the nights when no one else would. And now, you are not just healed, you are changed. Not hardened, not jaded, changed. Softer in the right places, stronger in the others, more aware, more honest, more whole. So if they ever come back, in thought, in message, in memory, you won't flinch. You won't collapse under the weight of unfinished business. Because that business is no longer yours to finish. You finished your part. You lived it fully. You grieved it deeply. You honored it with silence, with reflection, with survival. And now, you walk forward, not because it didn't matter, but because you do. And that's what being truly okay looks like, not forgetting, not replacing, but remembering without reliving, loving without losing yourself, carrying the past without letting it define your future. So breathe, feel the ground beneath your feet, let the memory pass through, and then, gently, keep walking. You are no longer waiting. And you are finally free. When they leave without saying goodbye, and you stay with every word left unsaid, there are goodbyes that echo. And then there are goodbyes that never happen at all. The ones that don't arrive with a slammed door or a bitter fight. They don't come with closure or clean endings. No final hug. No explanation. Just a slow fading. A quiet absence that settles like dust. One day, everything feels normal. You laugh, you talk, you share something small, and then the next they're gone. And not just physically, emotionally, energetically. You can feel the distance before you understand it, before it becomes real. They stop texting back. They don't return your calls. The jokes you used to share feel like echoes now, bouncing around a room where no one answers. You check your phone more often. You read into their last message like it's a code to be cracked. Did I say something wrong? Were they upset and I missed the signs? Are they okay or just done with me? But there are no answers, only silence. And that's where the pain starts to grow, not from what happened, but from what didn't. Not from words spoken, but from all the ones left behind. Being left without a goodbye leaves your brain in a loop of unfinished stories, unresolved meanings, and open-ended thoughts. You're not just mourning someone's absence. You're mourning the collapse of context, the confusion of having been part of someone's life, only to become a ghost in their narrative without explanation. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as ambiguous loss, a type of grief that doesn't follow the traditional path. When someone dies, there is mourning, closure, ritual. But when someone disappears emotionally, there is no social script, no funeral, no condolences, just confusion, uncertainty, and the subtle shame of being the one who was abandoned. You might not even talk about it, because it feels silly to some. You're upset just because someone stopped talking to you, but inside, it feels like a fracture, a tearing of something delicate that you didn't realize was breakable. Because when someone exits without warning, they don't just leave your life. They interrupt your self-perception. You begin to question your worth, your presence, your role in the connection. It becomes a psychological trap, trying to find reasons where there are none. And your brain, desperate for narrative closure, often fills in the blanks with your own insecurities. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough. Maybe I was too intense, too needy, too cold, too vulnerable, too much. You start believing it must have been something you did, something you missed, something you failed to be. Because surely, if they left without a word, it's because there was nothing worth saying goodbye to. And that is the cruelest illusion of all. The truth, the painful, quiet truth, is that many people leave not because of who you are, but because of who they aren't ready to be. Saying goodbye requires courage. It requires presence. It demands responsibility for someone else's emotional world, even briefly. Some people aren't capable of that, so they disappear, hoping the silence will do the work their voice couldn't. And while they move on, silently, perhaps comfortably, you're left holding 1,000 unsaid things. conversations that replay in your head, moments you now scrutinize for missed signals. You become haunted not by their absence, but by the version of yourself that existed in their presence. The version that laughed more freely, that opened up, that let someone in. And now that they're gone, you start to second-guess that openness. You wonder if trusting people is a flaw, if closeness always ends in confusion, if vulnerability is just a setup for abandonment. You may even find yourself pulling away from others, slowly, subtly, responding less, sharing less, being present, but with a quiet emotional wall. Not because you're angry, not because you don't care, but because you're trying to protect yourself from that feeling again. That feeling of standing in an emotional room where someone once lived, and realizing they've moved out without even leaving a note. This type of psychological abandonment can leave a deeper imprint than you realize. It may follow you into your relationships, into your self-worth, into your future decisions. You might begin to brace for endings before they begin. Expect silence. Anticipate rejection. Guard your joy just in case it's taken too soon. But here's the soft truth that exists under the ache. You are not the reason they left. You are not the silence they chose. You are the one who stayed present, the one who showed up, the one who cared deeply enough to be confused by their disappearance. That pain you carry, that ache of being left behind without a goodbye, it's not weakness. It's a sign of your depth, of your capacity to connect, of your willingness to feel. And that's something they didn't take from you. Even though it hurts now, that ability to be open, to be invested, to be real will serve you. Not because everyone deserves it, but because you do. You deserve to show up as someone who can still believe in connection, even after being wounded by it. Healing from this kind of abandonment doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from learning to grieve what was never said, from writing your own endings, from sitting with the absence and allowing it to exist without letting it define your future. And maybe, slowly, you begin to do just that. You begin to accept that not all relationships will come with clarity. Not all exits will make sense. Some people leave not because you failed, but because you mattered too much for them to handle. Your presence demanded depth they weren't ready to face. Your honesty required an answer they couldn't give. And so, they took the easy path, the quiet path, the one that left you in the middle of a sentence. But your story doesn't end there. You are still here, still breathing, still forming new beginnings. Even when the past hasn't yet closed its doors, you might never get the apology you deserve, the explanation, the farewell, but you can give yourself something better: understanding, grace, the soft truth that your emotions are valid, even if they weren't acknowledged, that your confusion has weight, even if it was never addressed. And tonight, as you try to sleep, maybe you don't have to fight those thoughts. Maybe you can let them in, not to dwell, but to release. Let the silence come. Let the memory surface. Let it say nothing. And let that be okay, because you have nothing left to prove. You loved. You showed up. You stayed. They didn't. That's not your failure. That's their unfinished story. And yours. Yours is still unfolding, page by page, night by night, into something beautifully whole. Now close your eyes. You don't need their goodbye to find peace. You only need your own permission to rest. When you become the one always watching others leave, there's a particular kind of ache that builds over time. Not in one heartbreak, not in a single abandonment, but slowly, across the years, like drops of water filling a glass. It begins when someone you care about leaves. And then it happens again, and again, sometimes with a goodbye, sometimes without, until, one day, you find yourself standing at the edge of yet another farewell, wondering why you're always the one being left behind. It's a pattern that doesn't announce itself immediately. It hides in moments that feel harmless. A friend who slowly stops reaching out. A partner who seems less present each day. A conversation that ends and never really picks back up. You tell yourself people drift, that it's natural, that life changes. But after enough goodbyes, Enough losses. The pattern begins to feel personal. Why does everyone leave? That question doesn't just sit quietly in your chest. It echoes. It distorts how you see yourself. You begin to believe there must be something in you, something faulty or incomplete, that pushes people away. You smile through the pain. Of course. You keep showing up. You make others laugh. You become the reliable one, the listener, the one who supports without asking for too much in return. Because deep down, you're afraid. Afraid that if you need too much, if you ask for too much, they'll leave too. And you've already seen enough backs turned away from you to last a lifetime. This fear isn't just emotional. It becomes behavioral. You begin shaping your personality around being likable, easy to be around, not a burden, not a problem. You learn to sense people's moods before they speak. You master the art of diffusing tension, of making yourself small so others can be comfortable. And you get good at it. So good that no one sees the exhaustion building inside you. Because being the one always left behind does something subtle but devastating. It teaches you to anticipate abandonment. You stop expecting people to stay. You begin emotionally preparing for exits long before they happen. You detach just enough to soften the blow. You withhold just enough of yourself to stay safe. But the cost is high. You begin to feel invisible, even in relationships where you're physically present, because you've learned to stay quiet when you're hurting. You've learned that speaking up might push them away faster. And so, you bottle it. You become the emotionally responsible one, the one who always understands, the one who never asks, "But what about me?" And maybe, over time, you start to forget what it even feels like to be fully held, to be fully chosen, to be someone's priority, not their option, not their backup plan, not their seasonal comfort, but their home. The psychological toll of repeated abandonment is real. Research shows that chronic loss or rejection can lead to a deeply ingrained attachment wound, where your nervous system remains in a state of low-grade alertness. You're constantly scanning for signs of distance. Your brain learns to equate closeness with danger, because the closer someone gets, the more it will hurt when they leave. This creates a kind of emotional paralysis. You want connection, desperately, but you're also terrified of it. You crave intimacy, but it feels like a trap. You hope for stability, but you don't believe it's real. So you keep your heart half closed. You share parts of yourself, but never the whole story. You say, "I'm fine," even when you're breaking. You smile through celebrations you weren't invited to. You pretend to be happy when someone tells you they're moving on, again. And inside, you wonder, what's wrong with me? But here's the truth you need to hear. Nothing. Nothing is wrong with you. You are not being abandoned because you're unworthy. You're not being left behind because you're unlovable. The world moves. People shift. Lives change. And yes, sometimes they leave. Sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with you at all. But the part that does matter, the part that is about you, is how you respond to the pattern. And for so long, your response has been survival. You've adapted to being the one who stays, who waits, who hurts quietly. You've made yourself resilient. And while that's admirable, it's also exhausting. You deserve more than to be the one watching others walk away. You deserve to be someone who has stayed for, who has fought for, who is loved not just in convenience, but in consistency. And that begins not with finding the right person, but with unlearning the story you've been telling yourself. The story that says, "Everyone leaves me." The story that whispers, "Don't get too close." The story that says your worth is defined by how long someone else chooses to stick around. Because your worth is not conditional. It is not up for negotiation. It is not tied to the behavior of others. It is inherent. And yes, it hurts to always be the one left behind. It's a grief that doesn't always come with words. It's a sadness that builds in quiet places, in grocery aisles where you shop alone, in the silence after a message goes unanswered, in the moment you realize another person has drifted away without even realizing they took a piece of you with them. But even in that sadness, you are whole. Even in that loneliness, you are complete. And even as people leave, you remain tender, open, growing. Tonight, let your breath soften. Let your mind rest from the loops of why and what if and how come. Let yourself feel the ache without needing to explain it. Yes, it's been hard. Yes, you've carried more than most. Yes, it's lonely to always be the one watching others leave. But you are still here. You are still lovable. And your story is not over. You're not always going to be the one who watches from the doorway as someone else walks away. One day, someone will stay, and it will feel different. Not because they complete you, but because they recognize the light you've carried all along. The light that stayed burning, even when the room emptied out. Now close your eyes. Let your heart take a breath. You are not alone in your pain. And you are no longer the person who has to prove they're worth staying for. You already are, just as you are. When you're still waiting for someone who already moved on, there's a kind of waiting that doesn't feel like waiting at first. It feels like hope. It feels like patience. It feels like giving someone time, space, understanding. You convince yourself that it's noble, that it's the right thing to do, because they're just busy, confused, going through something. They'll come around. They'll come back. But slowly, quietly, days pass, then weeks, then months, and you start to realize they're not coming back. They already left. The only person still standing in the doorway is you. But you don't leave. Not yet. You keep checking your phone. You keep rehearsing what you'll say if they text. You still replay old conversations in your head, looking for reassurance. You cling to the last message they sent, as if its words can anchor you in the past. You remember how they smiled, what they said, how it felt when everything still made sense. And so you wait. You wait not just for them, but for the version of yourself that existed when they were still here. This kind of emotional waiting is invisible. You go about your life. You work. You eat. You nod in conversations. But somewhere inside, you're stuck in a kind of pause, a suspended breath, a loop where time doesn't quite move the way it should. People around you tell you to move on, to let go. But how do you let go of someone who still lives in your thoughts, who still walks through your memories like a familiar ghost? The hardest part is that they're still out there, living, posting, laughing. Their life is no longer intertwined with yours, but you still feel their presence in everything. A song, a street, a scent, a small reminder that yanks you back into waiting, even when you swore you were done. And the truth is, waiting becomes a way of holding on. If you admit they're not coming back, it feels like betrayal, like giving up on something that once mattered so much. So you keep the door cracked open, just in case. But this door doesn't lead anywhere anymore. Psychologically, this kind of suspended hope creates a state of emotional arrested development. You're no longer growing in the direction of your own life. You're orienting yourself around the possible return of someone who has already made peace with leaving. You become emotionally stalled, unable to move forward, but too afraid to fully mourn what's gone. In some ways, the waiting is easier than grieving, because waiting leaves room for fantasy. It gives your mind something to hold on to, a future reunion, a redemption arc, a heartfelt apology, a dramatic realization. But these imagined returns are often more comforting than reality, because reality hurts. Reality means you were left, not because they had no choice, but because they made one. And the longer you wait, the more invisible you become to yourself. Your wants, your needs, your path, they all start to fade behind the silhouette of someone else's absence. You begin to forget what your life looked like without them. You stop asking what you want and instead wonder, what would they want me to be if they came back? And so, your identity gets built around someone who isn't even watching anymore. You might keep holding space for them in quiet ways, not dating anyone seriously, not changing your routines, leaving old photos up, holding on to messages, saving places that remind you of them. These rituals are not foolish. They're deeply human. They are acts of mourning disguised as hope. Because deep down, you're not just waiting for them. You're waiting for the version of life you thought you'd have together. But the longer you wait, the more it costs you. It costs you presence. It costs you energy. It costs you self-trust. Because every day you don't choose yourself is a day you choose the echo of someone who already chose something else. And that's the truth that eventually arrives. Quietly and painfully, they moved on. Not out of cruelty, not to punish you, but because their story took a turn you weren't meant to follow. And now, it's your story that's waiting to begin again. But it can't. Not while you're still paused in a chapter that no longer belongs to the present. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean erasing what was real. It simply means allowing your heart to step off the porch and back into the world. To return to yourself. To walk toward a future that isn't dependent on someone else's return. This moment, right now, is your chance to breathe again. To say to yourself, I waited, because I loved deeply. I waited, because I believed in something. But I will not spend my life paused. I will not make my worth conditional on someone else's decision to come back. Because waiting forever is not loyalty. It's self-abandonment in disguise. You are not a placeholder. You are not a backup plan. You are not the keeper of a flame someone else let die. You are a living, breathing, growing person, and you deserve to walk forward, not in bitterness, but in reclamation. Reclaim your time. Reclaim your dreams. Reclaim your joy, not the kind you once shared with them, but the kind that exists when you remember who you are on your own. It's okay if you're not ready yet. Healing is not a straight path. Sometimes we need to wait until the pain gets quiet enough for us to hear our own voice again. But let that voice speak. Let it tell you what it needs. Let it remind you of the life that's still waiting for you to live it. And tonight, as you lie down, maybe you can start with just this. You don't have to keep waiting. You don't need their return to justify your healing. You are allowed to move on, even if they never gave you permission, because you were never truly waiting for them. You were waiting to believe that your life could still be beautiful without them. And it can, and it will. Close your eyes now. Let the old dreams go. Make space for new ones. The door you've been watching has been closed for a long time. It's time to turn around. Your life is not behind you. It's still ahead, and it's waiting for you. When you realize you were always more invested than they were, some truths arrive slowly. Not because you weren't paying attention, but because you were hoping they weren't true. You replay the beginning, how they looked at you, how they talked, how they made you feel like you mattered. You remember the little gestures, the texts, the inside jokes, and for a while, it felt mutual, like a shared rhythm, a bond. But over time, something shifts. You begin to notice that the effort is lopsided, that you're the one starting the conversations. You're the one remembering the dates. You're the one asking the questions, reaching out, making plans. And they respond, yes, but rarely initiate, rarely follow through, rarely match your pace. At first, you make excuses for them. They're just busy. They're not great with messages. They show love differently. And maybe some of that is true. But deep down, something starts to ache. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like a bruise you keep bumping into. And then, one day, the ache turns into a realization. You were always more invested than they were. It's a heavy truth, because it forces you to re-examine the entire relationship. You start to see that the emotional weight was never evenly distributed, that you were the one carrying the hope, the effort, the heart. You were building something they were only leaning on. You were anchoring something they were only visiting. And that hurts, not because you gave too much, but because they took it without meeting you in the middle. The psychology of emotional imbalance is quiet and deeply disorienting. It's not about grand betrayals or cruel acts. It's about the slow erosion of reciprocity, about showing up fully while the other person remains halfway gone. You tell yourself to be patient, to give them space, to trust the process. But what you're really doing is shrinking, editing yourself, lowering your expectations, accepting crumbs and calling them meals. You begin to doubt your instincts. Maybe I am too much. Maybe I do expect too much. Maybe this is just what relationships feel like. But it's not. What you're feeling is not love's natural discomfort. It's emotional loneliness disguised as connection. This kind of experience teaches you a dangerous lesson. That being less will make people stay. That dimming your light will make you easier to love. And so, you start performing calmness when you're anxious. You start pretending you're okay with plans falling through. You stop asking the questions that matter because you already know the answers would hurt. You become a softer version of yourself. Not because you've grown, but because you've bent. Bent around their indifference. Bent around their absence. Bent around your own fear of being too much for someone who was never willing to hold enough. And then they leave. Or they fade. Or they stay but become emotionally unavailable. And you're left alone with the silence. With the what-ifs. And with the self-blame. But here's the truth that starts to grow in the wreckage. You weren't too much. You just gave your all to someone who never brought their own. And that difference, that emotional imbalance, is not a flaw in you. It's a reflection of their capacity, or lack of it. In relationships, psychological investment is not just about love. It's about presence, participation, curiosity. Someone who is invested doesn't just enjoy your company. They seek your mind. They notice your silences. They ask how you are and mean it. They show up in ways that matter to you, not just to them. But when you're the only one emotionally contributing, you become a performer, not a partner. You play the role of the caretaker, the planner, the emotionally intelligent one. You manage both hearts, yours and theirs. And in doing so, you forget how it feels to be received, to be held without having to first justify your existence. You become so used to giving that receiving starts to feel selfish. You've built your self-worth around how useful you are to others, rather than how loved you are for simply being. And when it ends, or when they stop trying, you don't just mourn the person. You mourn the version of yourself that was constantly in effort, the one who tried, who hoped, who held the space alone. But here's the healing truth that comes in the aftermath. There's nothing wrong with being someone who gives. There's nothing wrong with being emotionally invested. What matters is where you choose to place that investment. Not everyone is meant to carry your depth. Not everyone will reflect back your light. And that doesn't make your light any less beautiful. It simply means you were shining in a place where shadows preferred to stay hidden. You are allowed to want love that's balanced. Love that comes without begging. Love that doesn't need constant translation. You are allowed to stop proving that you're worth someone else's effort. You are worth it, even when others don't show up. And maybe, as time passes, you start to reclaim yourself. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop over-explaining your feelings. You stop trying to make someone see your value. Because slowly, you begin to feel it again, your own presence, independent of anyone else's gaze. You begin to relearn the rhythm of your own heartbeat, the quiet joy of choosing yourself. And you realize something beautiful. You were never too much. You were just more than they were ready for. And that's not your burden to carry. It's their lesson to learn. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, release the weight of over-effort. Let yourself breathe without reaching. Let yourself rest without waiting. You gave what you had. You showed up with your full heart. And that is not weakness. That is courage. You are not broken. You are not too intense. You are not wrong for loving deeply. You just deserve someone who loves just as deeply in return. Sleep now. There is peace in no longer proving your worth. There is freedom in knowing you were never the one who wasn't enough. You were simply the one who tried harder than someone else ever planned to try. When you become the placeholder in someone else's story, there's a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being almost chosen, from being someone's comfort, their routine, their habit, but never their decision. You're there, but never really held. Wanted, but never truly prioritized. Needed, but not for the reasons you hoped. You become the person they turn to when they're confused, when they're bored, when they're lonely, when their world is falling apart. They call you. They lean on you. They say, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And you believe them because it feels real. In those moments, it feels like you matter. But then they disappear again. They chase something else, someone else. They post pictures with people you've never met. They talk about dreams that don't include you. They use words like someday and maybe, always keeping the door half open, just enough for you to stay hopeful, but never enough for you to fully walk in. And you begin to realize you're not their person. You're their placeholder. You're the one they turn to while they search for what they really want. You're the safe space they return to when the world is unkind, but never the destination they choose when it's time to settle in. You are the emotional waiting room in someone else's journey toward clarity. And that realization doesn't come with drama. It comes quietly, slowly, like a slow wind brushing past a house that no longer feels like home. You notice how often the plans are on their terms, how the conversations are about them, how your kindness is used but never returned in the same measure. At first, you don't want to believe it. You tell yourself they're just scared, that they've been hurt before, that they're not ready. And maybe that's true. But readiness is not your responsibility. Their fear is not your burden. And your worth is not something that should be negotiated in someone else's indecision. Yet you stay. You stay because the almost love feels better than being truly alone. You stay because the moments of warmth are real, even if they're fleeting. You stay because part of you hopes that if you just love them enough, they'll see what's right in front of them. But deep down, it starts to wear you down. You feel it in your chest, that heavy, slow ache that comes from being close to someone who never lets you all the way in. You feel it when they talk about their dreams, and your name isn't in them. You feel it when they say, "You're important to me," but never show you what that means. Being a placeholder in someone's life is an invisible grief, one that doesn't get acknowledged, even by you, because they're still around. They still message you. They still say nice things. So what's wrong? What's wrong is that you've confused access for intimacy, availability for commitment, habit for love. You begin to question if you're asking too much. You start lowering your expectations. You stop asking for more. You tell yourself you're lucky to have even this. And slowly, you begin to shrink, not because they told you to, but because you believe that being smaller would make them stay longer. But the truth is, you deserve more than being someone's meanwhile. Psychologically, this experience creates a form of emotional displacement. Your identity becomes tied to being useful to someone who only values you in proximity to their own pain or uncertainty. You stop being a person in your own right and become a tool for their temporary relief. Their clarity comes at the cost of your confusion. And when they finally do move on, when they find the right person, the one they claim they're finally ready for, you're left behind. Quietly. No explosions. No drama. Just a slow retreat. The messages get shorter. The calls become rare. Your name starts disappearing from their world. And you're left with the memory of everything you gave, and nothing you were ever promised. It's a deeply personal kind of heartbreak, because it feels like a betrayal of your silence. You never asked for much. You never made demands. You just loved quietly, stayed patiently, hoped gently, and still it wasn't enough. But here's what you must understand. You were never meant to be a stepping stone in someone else's journey to themselves. You were never supposed to be the practice ground for someone else's love story. And you were never born to be an emotional placeholder. You are not a temporary fix. You are not someone's just for now. You are not the in-between. You are a whole world, a decision, a final choice, not a transitional one. And maybe, as hard as it is, this is your moment to leave the role you never agreed to play. To stop holding space for someone who only shows up when it's convenient. To stop watering a connection that never intended to bloom. Letting go doesn't mean you didn't care. It doesn't mean the moments weren't real. It simply means you are no longer available for love that hides behind uncertainty. You are no longer offering your heart to someone who treats it like an option. And yes, it's painful. It's lonely. It feels like mourning a person who isn't even gone yet, because part of you still believes they'll come around, that they'll realize, that they'll choose you finally, fully. But if they had meant to choose you, they would have by now. The ones who want you, really want you, they don't hesitate. They don't keep you waiting while they sort out their feelings. They don't show up only when it suits them. They don't make you prove yourself again and again. The ones who want you, choose you, without conditions, without delay. So tonight, let the image of being almost loved soften. Let the fantasy fade. Let yourself release the ache of what could have been. You are allowed to walk away from half commitments. You are allowed to want more. You are allowed to stop being the one who waits. Close your eyes now. You are not the background character in someone else's story. You are the author of your own. Let them go. You are no one's placeholder. You are the destination. And you never needed to be anything less than that. When the world moves on and doesn't notice you stayed, it happens gradually. A birthday missed. A group photo without you. A message that never arrives. And suddenly, you're not part of the conversation anymore. Not because you chose to leave, but because no one noticed that you stayed. That's the pain no one really talks about, not the heartbreak of being told to go, but the quiet devastation of never being asked to stay. You were still there. You were still reachable. You hadn't gone anywhere. But somehow, the world around you did. And not with cruelty. No one meant to hurt you. That's what makes it worse. It just happened. Like time moved forward and forgot to take you with it. You watch from the sidelines as people find new jobs, new friends, new routines. They seem happy. You like their photos. You send little hearts on their stories. You even tell them, "So happy for you." And you mean it. You really do. But somewhere inside, a small voice asks, "Why not me?" Or worse, "Why did they never think to check if I was still here?" This kind of loneliness isn't loud. It doesn't draw attention. It's not the kind you cry about in front of others. It's the kind you carry in quiet places, in your chest while brushing your teeth, in your thoughts as you walk home alone, in the silence between notifications that never light up your phone. Being forgotten hurts. But being accidentally forgotten, that does something deeper, because it doesn't come with a reason. There's no betrayal, no conflict, no final words, just a slow unraveling, like threads slipping from a spool, unraveling a connection you thought was permanent. And still you don't leave. You linger. You comment. You check in. You watch their world unfold, hoping for some small sign that you're still part of it. Maybe a tag, a memory, a message, anything. But most of the time, there's nothing. And so, a strange kind of grief begins to form. Not for a person, not even for a relationship, but for a version of yourself that used to feel connected, seen, included, psychologically. This experience is known as social invisibility, when a person feels unnoticed, unacknowledged, and excluded without direct rejection. It can happen in friendships, families, workplaces, even in your own neighborhood. And it can trigger profound feelings of worthlessness, because the human brain is wired to seek belonging. When you're no longer reflected in the lives of others, you start questioning if you ever mattered to them at all. And when no one reaches out, your mind does what minds do. It makes meaning. You begin to assume, maybe they just outgrew me. Maybe I'm too boring. Maybe I wasn't important after all. You take the absence personally, not because you want to, but because there's nothing else to explain it. You shrink a little more with every unanswered message. You talk less in group chats. You stop suggesting meetups. You start hiding your own milestones because you don't know who would even care. And yet you still care. That's the part that aches the most. You still remember their birthdays. You still smile when you hear a song that reminds you of them. You still hope, in some quiet part of you, that one day they'll remember. That one day, they'll look up and realize you were there all along. But the world doesn't slow down to notice who's waiting. And so, slowly, you learn to stop waiting. You start building your own small rituals again, listening to music alone, taking walks without checking your phone, watching the sun go down and letting that be enough. You start choosing solitude, not because you prefer it, but because it's more honest than begging for inclusion where none is offered. And maybe, slowly, you begin to see yourself not through the lens of who remembers you, but through your own quiet strength. You kept showing up, even when no one noticed. You kept caring, even when no one thanked you. You stayed present in a world that had moved on. That is not weakness. That is presence. That is resilience. That is you. It's easy to believe that if people forget you, it means you weren't important. But here's what's true. People are often wrapped up in their own storms, their own timelines, their own inner chaos. They forget not because you didn't matter, but because they were looking inward when they should have been looking around. It's not your job to remind the world that you exist. It's not your job to shrink just so they'll make room for you. It's not your job to chase after the echo of what once was. It's your job to remember yourself, to look in the mirror and say, I'm still here, to plant your feet back into the earth and whisper, I still matter, to reclaim your sense of worth, not through others, but through the simple, powerful act of continuing to be. You may have been left behind, yes, but you didn't vanish. You didn't give up. You didn't become lesser just because someone else moved forward. You are still here, still breathing, still full of stories yet to be told. And maybe one day, someone will come into your life who doesn't forget, who doesn't overlook, who doesn't need a reminder of your value, because they'll feel it in your presence, in your softness, in the way you show up with quiet strength. But even if that day is far away, even if it never comes, let this truth anchor you now. You are not invisible. Not to yourself. Not to the quiet universe that watches you try again and again to belong, to connect, to love. Not to this moment, which holds you exactly as you are. So tonight, close your eyes. Let the ache of being forgotten soften. Let the longing release its grip, just a little. Let yourself feel seen, not by them, but by you. You are not where you used to be. You are not who you were. And you are no longer required to wait for people who never turned around to notice you stayed. You stayed. That matters. You stayed. And now, you may choose to walk forward, into a world that may not always remember your name, but that cannot erase your worth. Rest now. You are not forgotten. You never were. When you stay loyal to a version of someone that no longer exists, there's a moment that quietly changes everything, though it often goes unnoticed. It's the moment when the person you care about, the one you laughed with, trusted, leaned on, begins to shift. At first, it's small, a difference in tone, a delayed response, a forgotten plan. You tell yourself it's nothing, that they're tired, distracted, going through something. But over time, the changes grow. The way they speak to you feels more distant. The warmth you once felt is harder to find. They begin making choices that don't include you. You see glimpses of a person you no longer recognize. And yet, you still hold on. Not because of who they are now, but because of who they were. Because of who they used to be to you. With you. For you. You hold on to the person who once made you feel seen. The one who knew how you took your coffee. The one who noticed when something was off. The one who showed up without being asked. The one who said things like, I'd never leave. And maybe they meant it. Once. Maybe that version of them truly existed, for a while. But something changed. And now, you're not holding their hand. You're holding their memory. And that memory, it's loyal. It's kind. It's the reason you're still here. You replay the highlights in your mind. The nights you stayed up talking. The random gifts. The way they looked at you that one time. And you felt understood in a way you didn't know was possible. These memories become sacred. Protected. You tell yourself, that was real. And you're right, it was. But what you don't tell yourself is the second truth. It's no longer real. not in the way it once was, not in the way it still lives in your heart. Psychologically, this is known as nostalgic attachment, when your emotional loyalty is rooted in a past version of someone, rather than the reality of who they are now. And it's one of the most difficult forms of being left behind, because it's not about physical absence. It's about emotional evolution, about being quietly outgrown by someone who didn't tell you they were changing. And so, you begin trying to rewind the story. You reach out more. You remind them of inside jokes. You suggest the same places you used to go. You try to stir something familiar, not because you're desperate, but because you're grieving. Grieving someone who isn't gone, just different. And grieving yourself too, the version of you who used to feel so alive around them. This type of pain is hard to articulate, because if you say it out loud, it sounds strange. They're still here, people might say. They didn't leave. But what they don't see is how it feels when someone emotionally departs while physically remaining. The conversations feel scripted. The affection feels polite. The laughter is thinner now. The magic, that spark of connection, is gone. And still, you don't want to let go. Because letting go means accepting that the chapter you loved so much has ended. It means releasing the image of someone who once made you feel whole. It means mourning someone who hasn't died, but simply changed into someone who no longer loves you the same way. And that feels unbearable. So you stay. You remain loyal to the version of them that felt like home. You stay in a relationship with a memory. You talk to their past self in your head. You defend their old kindness when they act indifferent now. Because to admit they're no longer that person would break something in you. But here's what happens when we stay too long in memory. We abandon the present. You stop noticing how lonely you've become. You stop asking how you feel in this version of the relationship. You start accepting the bare minimum, because the past was once full. But you deserve to be loved now, not just remembered by someone's former self. You deserve someone whose current presence matches your current vulnerability. Someone whose actions today reflect their promises from yesterday. Someone who doesn't just live in your past, but wants to build something in your future. And the longer you stay loyal to a person who's already changed, the more you start changing too, but not in ways that help you grow. You become quieter, more hesitant, less trusting of your needs. You start questioning if your sadness is your fault, if maybe you're just too emotional, if maybe you're clinging too hard. But what you're really doing is hoping that the version you remember will return, hoping that something you do will bring them back, hoping that this is just a phase. But it's not. It's the evolution of someone else's identity, one you weren't included in. And that's not your fault. People change, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And not every change includes you. Not every journey takes you with them. And so, you're left behind, not because you weren't enough, but because they became someone who no longer needed the things that used to hold you together. And maybe they're not cruel. Maybe they still care in a distant way. Maybe they still say, "I'm here," when you reach out. But you feel the difference. You feel the absence in their presence. And that's what hurts. Because it's not about being dumped. It's not about a breakup. It's about the slow erosion of connection that no one names. But tonight, maybe you can name it. Maybe you can look at yourself with kindness and say, "I miss who they were, but I miss who I was too." And maybe you can begin grieving, not just them, but the part of you that kept waiting for someone who no longer exists. You are allowed to let go, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for yourself, for your present, for the person you're becoming. Letting go is not betrayal. It's clarity. It's a gentle act of returning to yourself after being emotionally stranded in the past. And it will hurt, but not forever, because in the space where that memory lived, something new can grow, a new version of you, one that doesn't chase ghosts, one that doesn't perform loyalty to outdated love, one that walks forward, even if it means walking alone for a while. Close your eyes now. Let the memory fade, not into nothing, but into distance. Let your breath soften around the ache. You do not need to wait for someone to become who they once were. You can love them for who they were and still leave. You can honor the past and still choose yourself. Sleep now. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not holding on to a lie. You simply loved someone who changed. And now it's your turn.